Chapter 928. It was also raining in the capital of the kingdom of Qi. The chilly rain drenched the ginkgo trees by the street and the clothes of the passers-by. The ginkgo trees were still a long way from their most beautiful moment. There were not many tourists in the capital, so the streets in the rain were naturally a little lonely. Occasionally, coolies could be seen pulling carts in the rain. Their faces were full of wrinkles and numbness. It was hard to find the vitality of the Tangs. After the murder a few years ago, the lineage of the Dragon Tiger Mountain was lost. The investigation was naturally stopped when Long Qing returned to Haotian Taoism. The West Hill Divine Palace was increasingly respected in the kingdom of Qi. Taoist temples were built everywhere, and the people's faith in Haotian grew. However, it was obvious that the people's lives were getting worse. The Taoist temple of the West Hill Divine Palace was located in the north of the capital. The surface of the temple was painted with white powder and inlaid with countless gems. The eaves and rain paths were painted with gold powder. It looked extremely luxurious and solemn. However, the spring rain today was really heavy. The gems were extremely bright, but the temple itself looked a little cold. The deacons of the temple were unwilling to stand guard outside the temple in the rain. They had already hidden behind the door and were enjoying good wine and food under the cover of the rain so that they would not be seen by the believers. At this moment, the clear sound of hooves could be heard in the rain. A deacon opened the peephole on the door and looked out. He saw a handsome black horse breaking through the rain, dragging a very ordinary carriage behind it. The carriage stopped outside the temple. In the carriage, Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang and said, "It's easy to catch a cold in the rain. Let's rest here. We left some medicine here last time. I don't know if it will work." No matter how cold the rain was, how could Haotian catch a cold? His words seemed a little absurd. But in fact, Sang Sang's face was a little pale and she looked a little tired. Sang Sang had caught a cold after strolling in the Lank temple in the rain. It was hard to understand. Ning Ke sensed her body and found nothing wrong. The divine power in her body did not decrease, but she had caught a cold. Only humans would catch a cold and die of illness. Sang Sang did not feel particularly uncomfortable. She was not as sick and coughing blood as she did during the journey. She just felt a little dizzy and a little tired. She was not interested in doing anything. Ning Ke did not take it seriously at first. But later, he found that even her interest in food had decreased. He then realized that there was a big problem and became nervous. He found Monk Guanhai. Monk Guanhai was also very nervous. He immediately informed the two former eminent monks whom Ning Ke had met in the third bureau of Hua Mountain. They gathered all the monks in the temple and began to treat Sang Sang. Master Qishan was famous for his medical skills, and the Lank temple had inherited his skills. Naturally, they were many times better than the quacks in the world. Treating Haotian was undoubtedly the greatest glory of the Lank temple. Monk Guanhai was helpless. He had no choice but to follow Sang Sang's intuition. He guessed that she had probably caught a cold because the spring rain had soaked her green shirt. Ning Ke found it unbelievable that Haotian would catch a cold, but he had no other choice but to decoct the medicine according to the prescription of the monks in the temple, hoping that Sang Sang would recover after one night. After leaving the Lank temple, Sang Sang's health did not improve and she felt tired. After Ning Ke bought a carriage, she felt sleepy sitting in it every day. In fact, apart from being in low spirits, Sang Sang didn't have many other symptoms, and she didn't seem to be in any pain. If others saw her, they would probably think that she was sleepy. However, Ning Ke was very nervous because he knew that she would not feel sleepy in spring, let alone catch a cold. Her tiredness reminded him of that autumn when he brought her to the Lank temple for treatment. This made him very uneasy. Passing through the capital of the kingdom of Qi, Sang Sang became more and more tired. He remembered that he had left some rare herbs in the Taoist temple here, so he decided to rest here for a night. Moreover, he planned to bring Sang Sang here to reminisce about the past and to persuade her. The doors of the Taoist temple were tightly shut in the rain. Some believers who came to seek medical help knelt on the stone steps in front of the temple and kowtowed devoutly. They were all soaked and looked particularly pitiful. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke felt very bad. He did not sympathize with those believers, but he was a little unhappy with the people in the Taoist temple. Logically speaking, no matter how Taoism declined, it had nothing to do with him. But interestingly, he felt that since Haotian was his woman, Taoism should be his property. He could cause trouble, but how could those guys cause trouble for themselves? Walking to the front of the temple, he knocked on the door. His knuckles were a little pale. He silently counted in his heart. If no one opened the door after 3 knocks, he would kick the door open. With a creak, the door of the temple opened slowly. A hunchbacked middle-aged man walked out. Without looking up, he asked in a slightly hoarse voice, "What's the matter?" Ning Ke looked at the middle-aged man and felt a little strange. He was wearing a priest's robe that represented his noble status, but he gave people the feeling that he was an extremely inconspicuous odd-job worker. He asked, why didn't anyone receive the believers who came to seek medical help? The middle-aged priest sighed and was about to say something when several extremely arrogant voices came from behind him. What followed the voices was the rich aroma of wine and meat. "You damned cripple, I told you not to open the door. Are you blind? Hurry up and close the door. Do you still think it's like before? Old Chen Ciyuan is already dead. Who will protect you now?" Looking down, Ning Ke found that the middle-aged priest's legs were a little inconvenient. He knew who the old Chen Ciyuan in the Taoist temple was. Chen Ciyuan was a very senior red-robed priest in the Divine Hall of Light. He was pushed out of the Peach Mountain and was in charge of the Taoist temple in the kingdom of Qi. That autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang had met him in this temple. Then, in another autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang were trapped in Chaoyang city of the Yueluan kingdom and chased by the whole world. 3 red-robed priests self-destructed with the divine skill of light to help them escape. On the field outside Chaoyang city, a burning carriage appeared. That was the scene of the last old red-robed priest self-destructing with the divine skill. That person was Chen Ciyuan. Ning Ke also remembered who this middle-aged priest was. He said, "Lift up your head." The middle-aged priest raised his head and looked at Ning Ke's face. He felt that Ning Ke looked a little familiar. His eyes were a little confused, and then suddenly brightened because he recognized who Ning Ke was. And also because tears began to flow out of his eyes. "I went out to eat and drink with friends. I am a little tipsy." This chapter is 2,000 words long. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 929. 2 years ago, in Chaoyang City, Chen Ciyuan and the other 2 priests in red exploded themselves to help Ning Ke and Sang Sang escape. During their escape, the priests of the Divine Hall of Light had been secretly helping them. At that time, Sang Sang was the daughter of Yama. It was hard for outsiders to understand what they did. For Haotian Taoism, it was an unbearable betrayal. The West Hill Divine Palace was enraged, especially the hierarch and other bigwigs. They were enraged, so a bloody purge began quietly within Haotian Taoism. In just a few months, countless people had died. What was even more terrifying was that the outside world did not know about it at all. After Chen Ciyuan's death, the Taoist temple of the kingdom of Qi fell into the hands of a red-robed divine priest who was favored by the hierarch. The subordinates who were loyal to the old divine priest were severely tortured. As a trusted follower of Chen Ciyuan, the middle-aged divine priest was not spared. He offered a large sum of property that he had accumulated for decades to the new red-robed divine priest, and luckily survived. However, he could only do some chores in the Taoist temple. Although he was still a divine priest, he could no longer have the status he had before. He was even lower than an ordinary deacon. Even the guards at the door dared to scold him like a dog. The middle-aged priest thought that this was the end of his life. However, he would rather endure endless humiliation than leave the Taoism temple. Because he wanted to continue looking after it for Chen Xiyuan. He wanted to wait for the revival of the Divine Hall of Light. Most importantly, he was waiting for the young couple who had come to ask for medicine. Those who believed in Haotian would be rewarded. This was the clear meaning of the West Hill Divine Palace's scripture. The middle-aged priest finally received his reward. The spring rain was cold, and the ground in front of the Taoism temple was wet. Ning Ke listened quietly to the middle-aged priest's narration of the past 2 years and asked, "Where are the others in the Divine Hall of Light?" Through the middle-aged divine priest's answer, Ning Ke knew that in that bloody purge, the Divine Hall of Light, which had been weak for more than 10 years, had suffered a devastating disaster. Those old guys that the Divine Hall of Light had sent to various countries were basically all dead, and it was difficult for them to continue their legacy. The middle-aged priest cried bitterly as he spoke. Ning Ke did not speak. At this moment, Sang Sang's cold voice came from the carriage behind him. "Get in." Last spring, the Divine Hall of Light on Peach Mountain had changed. Many people in Taoism had vaguely guessed the truth, especially the middle-aged divine priest, who was a member of the Divine Hall of Light. He had endured the pressure of the new red-robed priest and the ridicule of the deacons for another year precisely because he had hope. He knew the relationship between Ning Ke and Haotian. When he heard the voice in the carriage, his face suddenly turned extremely pale. His body trembled violently as if he would faint the next moment. But at this moment, how could he fall unconscious? The middle-aged priest bit the tip of his tongue and forced himself to wake up with the pain. Then, he pushed the gate of the temple open with all his might. The main door of the Taoist hall was thick and heavy. He seemed to have used all his strength. His teeth were chattering and his joints were cracking. His expression seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. At this time, the red-robed priest was in charge of the affairs of Taoism in the kingdom of Qi. The deacons and guards in charge of the safety of the gate were naturally his trusted followers. They were drinking and merrymaking behind the gate. Previously, when the middle-aged priest opened the gate a little, those people were extremely annoyed. Now, seeing that he not only did not listen to them but also pushed the gate open completely, they could not help but become even more furious. When the gate was opened, the wind and rain outside fell in. The cold wind blew the dust under the bronze stove everywhere, and the rain diluted the meat soup in the copper pot. How could they not be angry? "Are you King crazy? Can't you see that we are boiling meat? If you don't close the gate, I will slap you." Curses kept ringing around the table. If it was any other time, the middle-aged priest would have admitted his mistake and hurried to remedy the situation after being scolded by the trusted followers of the red-robed priest. But today, he did not react at all. He held the reins and led the carriage into the Taoist hall. He looked humble, but those people were not in his eyes. Looking at this scene, those deacons and guards were a little surprised. Some of them were so angry that they laughed. Another deacon knocked on the edge of the pot with his chopsticks and simply cursed. Looking at these deacons and guards, Ning Ke could not help but shake his head when he thought of those worshippers outside the Taoist hall in the rain. The deacon knocked the copper pot even more loudly and cursed even more filthy. Ning Ke's hand fell on the hilt of his knife. There was water on the hilt, and it was slightly cold. He did not do anything because they were in the Taoist hall. The deacon who cursed suddenly found that something fell into the copper pot in front of him. As the soup boiled, that thing immediately began to emit a strong smell of meat. The deacon was a little surprised. He reached out his chopsticks and swung them in the soup. It was a very tender piece of pig's mouth. Such a big piece of pig's mouth. Why didn't you cut it before putting it into the pot? He habitually complained and scolded, but found that he was only opening his mouth, and no sound came out. His companions at the table looked at him with shocked and strange eyes. Those people seemed to have seen a ghost. The deacon was stunned, and then found that the front of his robe was full of blood. He screamed in panic, but still could not make a sound. Instead, he spat out a lot of blood. Until then, he found that his tongue had been cut off. His tongue was rolling in the boiling soup. His face was pale, and his expression became muddled. Subconsciously, he held the chopsticks with trembling hands and reached into the soup, trying to fish out the half-cooked tongue. At this time, a straight line of blood appeared on his wrist. His right hand holding the chopsticks was cut off at the wrist, and fell into the boiling soup, splashing a lot of soup. The scalding soup fell on his body, but he did not react at all, because he was already stunned. The deacons and guards at the table screamed because of the scalding soup. But their screams only lasted for a very short time, because the next moment, they also lost their tongues. The main entrance of the Taoist hall suddenly became silent. In the strange and horrible atmosphere, those deacons and guards turned pale in pain, and desperately covered their mouths. The next moment, they finally woke up and ran desperately into the hall. Ning Ke did not stop them. It was still quiet in the carriage. The middle-aged divine priest pulled the reins and looked at the backs of those people as if they were dead. He looked extremely indifferent, but deep in his eyes, there was the flame of revenge burning. The alarm in the Taoist hall rang, and the sound of armors and weapons colliding could be heard everywhere. The carriage slowly stopped when it reached the depth of the Taoist hall. Hundreds of divine priests, deacons, and fully armed cavalrymen came from all over the Taoist hall, forming a tight encirclement. A red-robed divine official with an arrogant expression walked out from the crowd. He looked at the middle-aged divine priest, Ning Ke, and the seemingly ordinary carriage, and slowly raised his arms indifferently, with his palms facing the gray sky. I don't care who you are, but this is the divine hall of Haotian. In the name of Haotian, let me send you to the deepest part of the netherworld with the most holy divine light. As soon as he finished speaking, a divine light slowly emerged from the palm of the red-robed divine priest. Ning Ke found that the Haotian divine light was very pure, which surprised him. He thought that the person Xiong Chumo chose to purge the divine hall of light was really capable. Looking at the holy divine light, hundreds of divine priests, deacons, and cavalrymen in the Taoist hall showed a look of awe. Even those who covered their mouths with their hands and were covered in blood became excited. But they did not expect what would happen next. The Haotian divine light fell directly on the body of the red-robed divine priest. Everyone was shocked and did not know what happened. Some stupid people thought that it was the new divine skill of the divine priest, until they found that the Lord in the flame was in great pain. The red-robed divine priest struggled desperately in the flame, trying to escape and lie on the ground to put out the fire. But he could not do anything except struggle. The holy flame burned fiercely on his body. His divine robe was instantly burned into ashes, and his skin was cracked, revealing his bloody flesh. It looked extremely miserable. The power of the Haotian divine light was so terrifying that it could melt copper and iron into liquid in an instant, let alone a human body. But somehow, the red-robed divine priest did not die immediately. It was even more terrifying because he had to endure the pain brought by the burning. The curtain of the carriage was lifted slightly. Sang Sang glanced at the scene without any expression. The Haotian divine light on the red-robed divine priest suddenly became fiercer, but the speed of the burning became slower. Not only his body, but also his Taoist heart. Even the most devout Haotian fanatic could not bear the absolute pain both physically and spiritually, let alone the red-robed divine priest who indulged in worldly pleasures. An extremely miserable howl suddenly rang out from the blazing holy fire. The shrill scream broke through the spring rain above the Taoist hall and the rain clouds above the capital of the kingdom of Qi. Then it fell on the streets and alleys of the capital and countless people. In the capital of the kingdom of Qi, hundreds of thousands of people heard the scream in the spring rain at the same time. The scream was full of infinite pain and regret. It was so clear and deep that people who heard it felt like they were carrying countless sins and knelt down. The hundreds of divine priests, deacons, and cavalrymen in the Taoist hall were even more so. They had already knelt down in the rain, a dense mass of people. Sang Sang looked a little tired. She ignored these people and walked directly into the hall. The people kneeling in the rain looked at her big figure and were extremely frightened. They wanted to attack, but found that their bodies were trembling as if they were about to fall apart. How could they stand up? Suddenly, thunderous hoofbeats sounded in the wind and rain outside the Taoist hall. A commander of the cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill came to the scene, soaked. Seeing his armor, the people kneeling in the rain recognized his identity. They were slightly refreshed and looked hopeful, thinking that the cavalrymen of the divine halls must be chasing after a strong enemy. No matter how powerful that woman was, how could she be a match for the cavalrymen of the divine halls? The people in the rain thought so, but they did not realize that what happened today was already beyond their imagination. With a bang, the commander of the cavalrymen of the divine halls knelt down with rain splashing everywhere. He looked at Sang Sang's back and touched his forehead heavily on the wet ground, not daring to raise his head. Ning Ke looked at the commander and said, "Finish it. Don't make too much noise." "Yes." The commander answered without hesitation and stood up to draw out his saber from the sheath. Hundreds of cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill who were on standby in the rain quietly poured into the hall. The people kneeling in the rain finally gave up hope. The story that Sang Sang asked Ning Ke to be the monarch and help the second prince of Wu marry a concubine came from the story of Armstrong. Before I started writing, some readers had already guessed what would happen in the end. Of course, I would not forget to play. My pleasure in writing came from playing with you. It suddenly rained in the Qin kingdom. It was colder than the spring rain. Like Sang Sang, I also caught a cold. I will write 1 chapter today and tomorrow, and 3 chapters the day after tomorrow and the day after that. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 930. It was very quiet in the Taoist hall. Only Ning Ke's footsteps echoed in the corridor. Walking up the stone stairs to the upper floor of the Taoist temple, he looked at the stone window on the side of the corridor facing the street. Light rain drifted in from outside the temple, gently sprinkling on Sang Sang's green clothes and expressionless cheeks. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke's emotions were somewhat complicated. After being washed by the spring rain, she seemed to become much lighter and her breath became much clearer, as if she would leave the world at any time. After seeing the broken stone statue of Buddha in the Lank temple, Sang Sang fell ill. Like a human, she began to feel tired and coughed occasionally. But at the same time, she became less and less like a human. To be left behind by the mortal world or to return to the divine kingdom was a problem that the academy wanted to solve. Ning Ke knew that it would be a long and dangerous process, just like a tug of war. Therefore, he was a little nervous, but he did not take it seriously. He walked to Sang Sang's side and looked out of the stone window at the capital of the kingdom of Qi in the rain. Neither of them spoke. They stood side by side in silence, as if they wanted to engrave the streets in the spring rain into their eyes. The street was washed clean by the rain. However, after a while, the rainwater on the street was gradually dyed red. Judging from the intensity of the color, it must have been a lot of blood flowing from the Taoist temple. The Taoist temple was still dead silent. The commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall of West Hill and his subordinates executed Ning Ke's request perfectly. They did not make a sound during the massacre. After a while, the main door of the Taoist hall was opened. Ning Ke saw several cavalrymen of the Divine Hall rushing into the spring rain at an extremely fast speed and then galloping away in several directions. These cavalrymen had to rush back to Peach Mountain to report the latest situation to their superiors in the Divine Halls. In addition, they had to inform the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls stationed outside the capital and their leaders. The 2,000 cavalrymen of West Hill Divine Palace followed them all the way. Ning Ke had always been curious about who was in charge. The cavalryman of the Divine Halls of West Hill, who was running toward the street south of the city, suddenly raised the flag in his hand that looked like a blood streamer and shouted loudly, as if he was admonishing the people on the street. Although the spring rain was not violent, it was so far away that the cavalryman's voice became a little muffled. However, Ning Ke's perception was so sharp that he heard the words clearly. Those who disrespect the light will be punished by the heavens. Ning Ke was very clear that the divine retribution was just an excuse. He and Sang Sang had been together for 20 years, and he had never seen her criticize anyone in person. Not to mention the fact that he had to stab someone with a knife. In human history, it was always the West Hill Divine Palace that condemned and killed the alien species on behalf of Haotian or in the name of Haotian. Haotian didn't even know about those things. Sang Sang was a little tired and went to rest. He stood by the stone window and looked at the capital of Qi Kingdom in the rain. He listened to the faint cries and battle cries in the rain without any expression on his face. In the wind and rain, there were faint cries of killing in the distance. Every once in a while, a team of cavalrymen from the Divine Halls of West Hill would come to the front of the Taoist Hall, untie the cloth bags under their saddles, and pour the contents of the bags onto the stone steps in front of the hall. The bags were filled with human heads. A day and a night passed just like that. There were more and more heads on the stone steps in front of the Taoist temple, and the smell of blood became stronger and stronger. The rain could not dilute it at all. In the counties around the capital of Qi Kingdom, there were 180 divine priests, deacons, and ordinary Taoists who had participated in the previous bloody purge of Haotian Taoism. All of them were beheaded by the cavalrymen from the Divine Halls of West Hill. The skulls on the stone steps were piled up like a small mountain. Some of the skulls had their eyes wide open, while others had expressions of regret and fear. Regardless of whether the owners of these skulls were noble red-robed priests or insignificant characters who were forced into the torrent, their faces were all covered in dirty blood. It was impossible to tell the difference between them. Sang Sang woke up and ate a bowl of porridge and 2 beef and radish buns with Ning Ke's help. Then she walked to the stone window and looked at the heads piled up like a small hill in front of the hall with satisfaction. The morning light was so fresh, and the painting in front of the hall was so bloody. The holy flame ignited on the pile of heads and quickly became fiercer. The rain could not extinguish the fire, but instead made it burn more fiercely. In the raging fire, one could vaguely see the deformed faces of the heads, as if the dead could still feel the pain. Their faces were twisted with anger and fear. An unpleasant burning smell permeated around the Taoist hall. In the spring rain, thousands of people of Qi were watching the scene in front of them. Their expressions were finally not as numb as usual. They looked a little frightened, but more excited to watch the fun. I am Haotian. Sang Sang looked at the pile of heads in the fire and said expressionlessly, humans must obey my will. Ning Ke thought for a while and said, or you can change the word to another way. Sang Sang glanced at him and said, for example? Ning Ke said, although I have no faith, I think there must be an element of love in this. Sang Sang said, humans will never love me. Ning Ke looked at the middle-aged divine priest in front of the hall with tears on his face and said, I brought you to Qi Kingdom to remind you that someone has always loved you, even if it means death. Sang Sang said, that is because I am Haotian. Ning Ke shook his head and said, in order to save you, Chen Xiyuan died, Hua Yin died, Song Sisi died, and many people in the divine hall of light died. At that time, you were not Haotian, but the daughter of Yama. Sang Sang said, that is because they believed in Wei Guangming. Ning Ke said, but isn't this kind of belief precious? Sang Sang was silent. Ning Ke said, you said that Master Qishan saved you to save all living beings, but you are not among them, so he did not really love you. Then what about the people in the divine hall of light? What about your teacher Wei Guangming? They only love you. They loved you when they did not know you were Haotian, and they loved you when they knew you were Haotian. They love you unconditionally, so why can't you give them the same love? Sang Sang said, so I should love the world? Ning Ke said, in the first chapter of the West Hill Divine Palace, it is said that God loves the world. Sang Sang said, I don't love it anymore. Ning Ke said, because you are too tired? Sang Sang glanced at him and said, your jokes are often illogical. Ning Ke said, otherwise, why wouldn't I love it? Sang Sang said, why should I love the world? Ning Ke thought about it and found that this was indeed a problem. No matter which world it was, all questions were afraid to be asked. For example, the word love that human beings could not forget. Once it was asked, there would be an echo. Yes, why did it have to be love? Why did mothers love their children? Why did women love their men? Why did people love their country? Even if there seemed to be no conditions for love, in the deepest part of it, one could only get an answer that was so cold that it was difficult to breathe. Ning Ke did not know how to answer this question. Just like in the Great River Kingdom, he did not explain love to her clearly. Now, he could not explain what love was. At this moment, a divine chariot slowly came from the other end of the long street in the spring rain. The veil around the divine chariot was dark red. After being wet by the rain, it seemed to be dripping blood, which made it look particularly chilling. The divine priest of judgment had once again come to the human world. Ning Ke was not surprised. When he was at the South Sea, he had vaguely guessed who the leader of the cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill was. This day and night of bloody purge confirmed his guess. There were only a few people in the divine halls of West Hill who could make such an important decision in such a short time and implement it. She, who was directly in charge of the cavalrymen of the divine halls, was the most likely one. I don't want to see these people. Sang Sang turned and walked into the room. Her voice sounded a little tired. Those who disrespected the light in the 3 counties of the Qi kingdom are all dead. Yi Hongyu said, the Divine Hall's official decree should be sent to all countries in a few days. The Divine Hall of Judgment has already taken action in advance. I believe it will not take long for the purge to end. Ning Ke looked at her and frowned slightly. He always felt that it was not so simple. Yi Hongyu took off the divine crown and looked at him, saying, I want to see Haotian. The scene at this moment was really like that autumn many years ago. Ning Ke reached out and wanted to take the divine crown from her, just like that time. Yi Hongyu did not give it to him. Ning Ke said, have you become estranged so soon? Back then, you were. Yi Hongyu said, don't be glib. I am not that crazy Mo Shanshan. I don't want to steal a man from Haotian. Ning Ke clicked his tongue and said, aren't you being glib? Yi Hongyu brushed off the raindrops on her black hair and said, stop talking nonsense and lead the way. Ning Ke said unhappily, you know that I am Haotian's man, but you don't know how to respect me. Yi Hongyu threw the divine crown on the table and said, how can a man who lives off a woman be respected? Ning Ke said angrily, say that again. Yi Hongyu tied up her wet black hair and said, you are a man who lives off a woman. Ning Ke suddenly understood how Chen Pipi used to feel. He said angrily, it is not easy to live off Haotian. Yi Hongyu said, it is not easy to live off a woman. The way they said it was not easy was obviously not emotional. Ning Ke was very embarrassed and could not continue this topic. He said, she doesn't want to see people from the Divine Hall. Yi Hongyu thought for a while and said, "That's fine. I don't want to kneel to her either." Ning Ke said, "It seems that your faith is not as strong as you said before." Yi Hongyu was silent for a while and suddenly asked, "Which is more important, faith or hatred?" Ning Ke did not understand why she would ask this question. He thought of the revenge in Chang'an and the killing in the snow lake. He said, "If it were me, revenge would be more important. Of course, that is because I have no faith to begin with." He looked at Yi Hongyu and said solemnly, "As for what you should choose, I can't give you any specific advice. I only want to say that you should do what makes you happy." Yi Hongyu thought for a while and said, "Is this the principle of starting from the heart?" Ning Ke said, "Yes, instinct and the heart are always the strongest. If the heavens had feelings, the heavens would grow old, so they would get sick. I am a mortal, and a middle-aged fat man who rarely exercises. There is nothing I can do even if I keep getting sick. Another day of dizziness, and I can only write one chapter. Actually, I am even more anxious. I want to get better as soon as possible. This month's 200,000 renminbi is still waiting for me on the last day. I wish everyone good health and everything goes smoothly. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 931. They had known each other for many years. They used to be irreconcilable enemies, but they had also fought side by side. The relationship between Ning Ke and Yi Hongyu had always been delicate. Before the right to light, he had gone to the Divine Hall of Judgment to find her. Yi Hongyu had given him a way out, which meant he owed her again. That was why he had answered her seriously. He wanted to help her. Which was more important, faith or hatred? Ning Ke knew that Yi Hongyu was not a believer like him. So there must be a specific reason for her question. But what was it? After Yu and Haotian left, the Abbey Dean went up the mountain. Yi Hongyu said, "The hierarch seemed to be subservient, but in fact, Taoism was still in a balance. Long Qing had become very powerful, and I didn't like many things." Ning Ke said, "So you chose to leave Peach Mountain?" Yi Hongyu said, "I just came to see where you were going to take Haotian." Ning Ke asked, "Why do you want to see her?" Yi Hongyu said after a moment of silence, "Or maybe I want to gain some courage through her." Ning Ke seemed to understand something and said, "In fact, you have already started. I want to know what kind of hatred you have with Xiong Chumo. The purge that started last night was a counterattack by the Divine Hall of Light with the help of Haotian's power. The Divine Hall of Judgment should not have responded so quickly and resolutely. But if one thought about it, the main force that purged the Divine Hall of Light was the hierarch's trusted followers, then one could understand the reason. The purge would definitely shake the hierarch's foundation." Yi Hongyu did not answer his question, but said, "I am just carrying out Haotian's will." Ning Ke said, "You are forcing Haotian to give orders to Taoism." Yi Hongyu looked at him and said sarcastically, "Isn't that what you have been trying to do?" Since she did not want to tell him the reason for the hatred, Ning Ke did not ask further. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Even if you succeed, what will you do in the future?" Yi Hongyu said, "Succeed first, then talk about the future." Ning Ke said, "What's the point of becoming the new hierarch or the Abbey Dean of the West Hill Divine Palace?" Last year in Chang'an, he had said something similar to her. The academy has to pay attention to the meaning of everything. But for me, I don't care about this or whether it's meaningful. I only care about whether it's worth doing. Yi Hongyu said, "I have my own plans." "Where do you want to take Haotian?" "Right now, the whole world is guessing where your journey will end." Ning Ke said, "I don't have the ability to take her away. In fact, she wants to see the human world herself. She wants to go to these places of our own accord." Yi Hongyu did not know what to say. The current situation had never happened in human history. Even the Abbey Dean had no experience in this and could only watch quietly. Ning Ke said, "Now I can only take one step at a time and see how far I can go." Yi Hongyu said, "It's like crossing the river by groping for stones." Ning Ke recalled the scene when he and Sang Sang crossed the river. He shook his head and said with a smile, "We don't need to touch the stones to cross the river." That was the end of the conversation. Yi Hongyu returned to Peach Mountain with 2,000 cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace. Haotian would continue to punish Haotian Taoism. No one knew when it would truly stop. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left the capital of the Kingdom of Qi and continued their journey to the west. They walked among the green hills in the spring rain and came to the Red Lotus Temple that had been burned into ruins. Looking at the rubble, the weeds, the scorched wood, and the wild mushrooms growing among the wet wood, Ning Ke was silent for a long time. He thought about Yi Hongyu's words and felt a little complicated. Long Qing had led the fallen cavalrymen to besiege him and Sang Sang in the rain in front of this ruined temple. He broke out in desperation and used the practice of Tao Tai to injure Long Qing. Then he broke through the knowing destiny state. Now, Long Qing had become even more powerful. Ning Ke knew how proud and confident Yi Hongyu was. Long Qing was a dazzling beauty in the eyes of the world. But in her eyes, he was just an ordinary subordinate. There was nothing special about him. Even she had to admit that Long Qing was powerful. This meant that Long Qing was really powerful now. In many people's eyes, Ning Ke and Long Qing were lifelong enemies. In the end, one of them would die and the other would win to end their parallel lives. If Long Qing really became powerful, Ning Ke would be the one who would have a headache. But in fact, he was just looking at the ruined temple in the spring rain and felt emotional. Yi Hongyu used the name of Haotian to carry out a bloody purge in Haotian Taoism and weaken the power of the hierarch. No one dared to oppose her. Now that he was traveling with Haotian, why would he worry about the power of the human world? Using Haotian to control Haotian Taoism would naturally be peaceful. With Haotian traveling, the human world would naturally be peaceful. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left the West Hill Divine Palace and went south to the Great River. They went along the coast to the Hua Mountain to visit Lank. Then they went to the Kingdom of Qi and passed by the Red Lotus Temple. After traveling for several months, they finally entered the South Jin Kingdom. For Sang Sang, this was a war between her and the human world. For Ning Ke, this was a means to keep her. For them, this was a trip back in autumn a few years ago. For the human world, this journey was endowed with a more complicated and sacred meaning. Countless pairs of eyes were watching and following their footsteps. Many people held their breath and kept quiet because of this. As they walked, their mood fluctuated. They forgot to eat and sleep, and their minds were in a mess. Naturally, they also forgot the disputes between each other. There was a nameless lake in the east of the South Jin Kingdom. Compared to the vast Great Swamp in the north, it was so shabby that people wanted to cover their faces. Moreover, it was located in the remote mountains, and no one lived by the lake. It was extraordinarily quiet. Ning Ke sat by the lake and roasted fish. The bonfire was well controlled. Sang Sang did not need to do anything. His understanding of Haotian's divine flame was also useful in cooking. The surface of the fish had been roasted to a golden brown, but the fat and tender flesh was still delicious. Sang Sang took the roasted fish from Ning Ke's hands. She did not eat it expressionlessly as usual, and then expressed her satisfaction with the speed. Instead, she continued to stare at the lake in a daze. The lake was very small and looked pitiful among the mountains. But as long as one sat by the lake, he would definitely be able to see the moon in the lake. It was a full moon today. The round moon hung in the night sky, taking away the brilliance of all the stars and sprinkling countless silver lights on the human world. The eyes of the fish in the lake were illuminated by the light. Sang Sang looked at the moon that gently rose and fell with the lake. Her face was slightly pale and she looked a little tired. Ning Ke had long noticed this phenomenon. Every time the moon in the night sky was full, Sang Sang would become weak, and when the moon was waning or there were clouds, she would become strong again. Of course, this kind of strength or weakness was only relative to her original almost infinite power. Even when she was at her weakest, she was still more powerful than all the cultivators in the human world combined. Although the war between the headmaster of academy and Haotian took place in the firmament, the result of the war would eventually fall back to the human world, because Haotian was also in the human world. The moon waxed and waned, and people were born, grew old, got sick, and died. Sang Sang became more and more like a human, so she began to get sick. If this continued, would she die of old age? If Ning Ke could figure out the reason, how could she not? Do you want me to die so badly? Sang Sang looked at the bright moon in the lake and asked Ning Ke beside her. On the balcony of the divine hall of light, she had asked this question in her heart when she saw Ning Ke falling into the abyss at all costs. Now, she asked it in front of Ning Quebec. Ning Ke was silent for a long time and said, "There will be a way." Sang Sang said, "This is an objective question, not a subjective one." Ning Ke did not know how to answer. The lakeside was silent. The night wind blew on the surface of the water, and the bright moon was crushed. Then, as the water gently swayed, the moon slowly gathered again, as if nothing had happened. In the depths of Sang Sang's eyes, countless stars were destroyed and reborn. That was her anger. Tens of thousands of stars in the night sky suddenly shone brightly. They were so faint that they could not be seen a moment ago, but in the next moment, they were so dazzling that they instantly covered the light of the bright moon. The human world in the middle of the night suddenly became as bright as day. Especially the small lake in the mountains, it seemed to have become a bright divine kingdom. Countless divine halos fell, and the lake began to boil. Mist filled the air. The fish in the water were frightened and swam around, desperately drilling into the water plants and rocks in the lake. But how could they escape from the power of heaven? A thunder-like roar sounded in the mountains. The lake water gushed up to the night sky like a huge fountain, and the water splashed over the peak behind it. When it fell, it was a warm rain, very much like tears. The stars in the sky gradually disappeared, and the lake and mountains gradually quieted down. Hundreds of fish lay in the mud of the lake with their bellies turned over. They were steaming and had been cooked. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were soaked by the lake water, and they looked very embarrassed. The rainwater gathered in the lake again, and it gradually became clear again. Sang Sang's face was stained with some mud, and she looked like a naughty child. Ning Ke carried a basin of lake water and squatted in front of her. He wet the towel and washed her face gently and carefully, wiping off the mud on her face. If heaven had feelings, it was only for a moment. Most of the time, Sang Sang was calm and silent. She was calm because everything was still within her calculations. She was silent because she did not think that any human was qualified to communicate with her spiritually. Ning Ke might be qualified, but she was getting more and more annoyed with him. They walked calmly and silently. They left the wild lake in the mountains and came to the fields with crisscrossed paths. The carriage had already collapsed, and only the big black horse followed them silently. Along the official road, Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked into Lincoln, the capital of the South Jin Kingdom. Ning Ke was not unfamiliar with this city. He came to the eastern part of the city and walked into the depths of the slums. The streets were still narrow, and the smell was still unpleasant. The temporary buildings built by the families were still so fragile, and the curtains outside the toilets were still so short that one could see the heads. But finally, there were changes. There was less sewage in the streets, and it became relatively dry. Naturally, the mosquitoes and flies were not as rampant as before. Most importantly, the people walking in it seemed to be more lively. Ning Ke was a little surprised that so many changes had happened in less than a year. He admired the man who preached in the shabby alley even more. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the shabby house, listening to the preaching. The preaching man wore a thin old shirt, and his hair was combed into a bun. There was an old chopstick in the bun, and he looked calm and composed. The content of his preaching was from the West Hill scriptures, but the way he explained was very different. Sang Sang looked at that place and suddenly said, "These people should all be burned to death." There is another chapter today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 932. Compared with the last time Ning Ke saw Yi Su in Lincoln, Yi Su looked thinner and paler. But he looked calmer, without any trace of arrogance. There were hundreds of people listening to his sermon, filling up the entire alley. However, no one made a sound, and the place was unimaginably quiet. His voice kept ringing in the quiet alley in front of the dilapidated house, mixed with a few painful coughs. The content of his preaching was mainly the West Hill scripture, which was quite different from that of ordinary priests. Ning Ke's eyes fell on the people who were listening to the preaching. Although the clothes of these believers were simple, and many of them had patches on their clothes, they were all very clean. The dozens of people in the southeast were obviously much wealthier in their clothes, but they were also sitting quietly on the white futons like their companions. Through observation, he found that Yi Su's preaching was much smoother than expected, which made him even more worried. Because Sang Sang said that these people should be burned to death. He knew that she would do it. Soon after Yi Su started preaching in Lincoln, Ning Ke came here. He knew that this was Yi Su's self-redemption, and he wanted to lead the world to realize self-redemption. Haotian Taoism required believers to turn their desires into offerings based on their faith in Haotian, and to place their hopes on the divine kingdom. Yi Su's redemption was to seek help from themselves. For Haotian Taoism, this change seemed small, but in fact, it was a shocking revolution, because this revolution started from the bottom. It replaced the yearning for the divine kingdom with the love of the world, and asked the believers to save themselves. If all this could be successful, then what position would Haotian Taoism be in? Haotian is watching you. Yi Su stood in front of the dilapidated house and looked at the believers. He said calmly, "No matter what you do, no matter what you think, you are under Haotian's watch. So you have to reflect on your behavior all the time, from morning to dusk, from waking up to sleeping. You can go against Haotian's doctrine, but have you done good? Have you restrained evil?" Ning Ke couldn't help but look at Sang Sang beside him. Sang Sang was looking at Yi Su. Haotian was looking at him. She didn't say anything, but just listened to his preaching without any expression. Actually, what he said is not completely unreasonable. Ning Ke said, "Eliminating the intermediate link of the West Hill Divine Palace, and the believers will directly dedicate their love to you. From the perspective of logistics, it can improve efficiency and save costs." Sang Sang said, "The divine kingdom belongs to the divine kingdom, and the secular world belongs to the secular world. So, is the Haotian they believe in me or each of them?" Ning Ke could not answer this question. Yi Su's preaching was to fundamentally overthrow the doctrine of Haotian Taoism and to separate the specific meaning of the faith into self-awareness. From this point of view, the faith of these believers was not the faith that Haotian needed, because it was very likely that Haotian could no longer absorb their power of faith. While the two of them were talking, today's teachings had already ended. Hundreds of believers left in an orderly manner, leaving a group of children to tidy up the venue and prepare for the afternoon craft class. Yi Su covered his mouth with his hand and coughed twice. When he was about to take down the blackboard hanging in front of the window, he suddenly saw Ning Ke and Sang Sang outside the crowd. His body stiffened involuntarily. The door of the shabby house was pushed open. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked in and were surprised to see Chen Pipi lying on the bed and Tang Xiaotang cooking by the stove in the corner. Chen Pipi opened his eyes and looked at Ning Ke with a smile. However, his smile froze on his face before he could wave his hand. The spatula in Tang Xiaotang's hand also froze in the air. They had never seen Sang Sang at this time. But since they saw Ning Ke, they naturally knew who the woman beside him was. Yi Su had already lifted the front of his robe and obediently knelt in front of Sang Sang. Sang Sang indifferently looked at everything in the house with her hands behind her back. She did not speak, so Yi Su did not get up and humbly knelt. Sang Sang's eyes fell on him without a trace of warmth. 20 years ago, in the wilderness, you called Tang an evil demon and Qi Nian an outsider. If you saw you now, what would you call me? Many years ago, she was born in a doctor's mansion in Chang'an. Yi Su said a few words when Ning Ke climbed over the wall with a blood-stained chopper and a black line appeared on the wilderness. Ning Ke's expression was a bit complicated. Yi Su was silent for a long time and said calmly and firmly, "Today, I am not as stupid as I was yesterday. Yesterday, I will not be as evil as I am today." Sang Sang said, "How is blasphemy not evil?" Yi Su said, "Humans are ants, and they want to live a better life." Sang Sang said, "For countless years, I have never punished or punished anyone." Yi Su said, "What do you mean by everlasting night?" Sang Sang said, "It's just pruning." Yi Su said, "Every branch and every leaf is a life." Sang Sang said, "The Buddha is lying." Yi Su said, "The Buddha does not speak. Life is also a life." There was a dead silence in the dilapidated house. Sang Sang and Yi Su's voices kept ringing, and the atmosphere became heavier and more depressing. Tang Xiaotang was holding a spatula in front of the stove, and there was a faint burning smell behind her. As a former world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, he dared to point out Haotian's wrongdoings and insisted on his own opinion. Yi Su, who had become a cripple, was stronger than most people in the world. Sang Sang asked, "If people want me to save them, why bother to save themselves?" Yi Su said, "Haotian loves people. How can he not allow people to save themselves?" Sang Sang glanced at Ning Ke and said, "Why should I love people?" She had asked Ning Ke this question before, but Ning Ke could not answer. Yi Su, who was much more knowledgeable than Ning Ke, could not answer either. But he could make a rhetorical question. If so, why should people love Haotian? Sang Sang's willowy eyes suddenly became bright and extremely cold. With a sizzling sound, the vegetables in the iron pot behind Tang Xiaotang were finally burnt. Ning Ke clapped his hands and said, "I'm suddenly so hungry. I want to eat." Chen Pipi sat up from the bed and shouted angrily at Tang Xiaotang, "How can you burn a vegetable? Are you going to let me eat? Do you want to starve your husband?" Tang Xiaotang knew what they wanted to do, but she still felt wronged. She waved the spatula and shouted angrily, "I have never cooked in the tribe or in the back of the mountain. Why should I cook?" Ning Ke walked to Sang Sang and asked, "Are you hungry? What do you want to eat?" Chen Pipi rolled up from the bed and helped Yi Su to sit on the edge of the bed. Then, he looked at Sang Sang and said, "Seriously, I haven't eaten your cooking for several years. Do you want to show me your cooking today?" Seeing that no one paid attention to her, Tang Xiaotang kept turning the burnt vegetables in the iron pot with the spatula and looked very wronged. In an instant, the room turned from dead silence to extremely noisy. In an instant, the room was filled with the smoke of the human world. In an instant, a table of dishes was ready. Sang Sang was not used to this change and looked a little confused. Before she could figure it out, she was led to the table by Ning Ke and sat down. Tang Xiaotang put a bowl of white rice in her hand. Ning Ke and Chen Pipi looked at each other and saw the lingering fear in each other's eyes. They wiped the cold sweat on their foreheads. Only these two brothers could react so quickly and dare to fool Haotian like this. Sitting at the table, Ning Ke said to Yi Su, "Let me formally introduce you to my wife, Sang Sang." Yi Su also did not come to his senses. He nodded subconsciously and said to Sang Sang, "Just some home-cooked dishes. Feel free to eat. Just treat it as your own home." After saying this, he felt that it was a little strange. Sang Sang did not say anything and quietly looked at the white rice in her hand and the green vegetables on it. The people sitting at the table were worried that she would suddenly wake up. Chen Pipi desperately winked and tried to get Tang Xiaotang to say something. Tang Xiaotang widened her eyes and thought that she was not good at talking. Shouldn't Chen Pipi and Ning Ke be the ones to do this? Chen Pipi kept coughing and thought, "Aren't you her best friend?" Tang Xiaotang looked at the men sitting at the table like clay statues and suddenly felt that something was missing. She asked, "Where is the big black horse? I heard that he also left Peach Mountain. I thought he would follow you." Any topic, as long as someone started it, Ning Ke had the ability to drag it away. He pretended to be surprised and asked, "How do you know what happened in the divine halls of West Hill?" Chen Pipi interrupted at the right time, "We left West Hill with the disciples of the Sword Garret and now live in Linkong City. Lu Yiqing will naturally inform us about what happened in the cultivation world." Tang Xiaotang very timely pulled the topic back again, "Where is the big black horse? He is too big. I am afraid that he will bump into people in the alley, so I let him stay in the mountain outside the city." Ning Ke said, "Speaking of which, how have you been these days?" Chen Pipi said helplessly, "I have been listening to senior brother's lectures every day. My ears are calloused." Tang Xiaotang stared at him fiercely. Ning Ke wanted to strangle him. He thought, "Everyone says that you are the most talented guy in Haotian Taoism and the academy. How come you suddenly become a pig brain? We have finally diverted the topic, but you bring it back to Yisu's preaching. What are you doing?" Chen Pipi also realized that he had said something wrong. He was anxious and secretly glanced at Sang Sang. Sang Sang knew that he was secretly looking at her. She said expressionlessly, "Let's eat." Everyone answered obediently and then began to eat, not daring to speak again. Not talking while eating meant concentration, and concentration naturally led to fast eating. Before long, all the food on the table was cleared. Chen Pipi very irresponsibly hid in the kitchen to wash the dishes, leaving the heavy responsibility to others. Sang Sang stood up and looked at Tang Xiaotang, saying, "You." Tang Xiaotang stood up nervously and said, "What's the matter?" Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and walked out of the room. She said, "Follow me." Tang Xiaotang glanced at everyone and did not know what to do. Ning Ke comforted her, "Don't worry. I have never seen her eat people. How can you comfort people like that?" Chen Pipi rushed over with a wet rag in his hand and looked at him with grief and indignation. Then he looked at Sang Sang's back and said in a trembling voice, "Come back early if you have nothing else to do. There will be wine and meat tonight. I have something to deal with tomorrow. The update will be late. Have a good weekend." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 933. During the winter, the drainage system in the alley was completely renovated. Although it was not as waterproof as the imperial palace of the South Jin Kingdom, the continuous spring rain did not leave many traces here. It proved that under Yisu's leadership, the hard work of the believers had finally paid off. Sang Sang walked through the street with her hands behind her back. Tang Xiaotang followed her. Her black braids swayed in the spring breeze. Just like her mood, she could not calm down. She and Sang Sang were indeed best friends. But Sang Sang was Haotian now, and she was a member of the Devil's Doctrine. It was impossible for their friendship to continue. So why did Sang Sang bring her out? Tang Xiaotang was not used to her once tanned and skinny friend becoming white and chubby. She was also not used to the silence along the way. She gently kicked the stones on the street as if she was bored to death, but in fact, she was talking to relieve her tension. Sang Sang suddenly stopped in front of a vegetable shop at the end of the street. She said, "He is a useless man now." Tang Xiaotang was startled. Then she realized who she was talking about. She said, "His ocean of qi and mountain of snow was locked by you. His body is weak and he likes to stay in bed every day. He is indeed a useless man." Sang Sang walked into the vegetable shop and looked at the vegetables on the shelf. She said, "I left Peach Mountain. I think the divine halls must have started to hunt you." Tang Xiaotang said, "Yes. The Qinghe kingdom is very strict. Otherwise, we would have returned to Chang'an long ago." Sang Sang stopped and turned to her. She asked, "Then why?" Tang Xiaotang was confused. She asked, "What? Why?" Sang Sang said, "Everything is destined. Why did you go to Peach Mountain to save him? Why did you accompany him to wander the world? If you are willing to surrender to me, I will grant you immortality." In an inconspicuous vegetable shop in Lingang, amid the smell of all kinds of vegetables and mud, Sang Sang calmly said that she would grant him immortality. Tang Xiaotang was stunned for a long time. She said unnaturally, "It's so sudden. Let's buy the vegetables for tonight first." At this moment, the female shopkeeper recognized her. She greeted her warmly and humbly. When Sang Sang saw some vegetables, she grabbed them and put them in the basket. Sang Sang was a little puzzled. She pointed to the basket and asked, "Why don't we need money to buy vegetables?" These days, Tang Xiaotang, Chen Pipi, and Yi Su lived together. Usually, they would teach some lessons to the children in the streets. To the people living in this area, Yi Su, who lived in a dilapidated house, was no different from a saint. This kind of respect and love naturally fell on her and Chen Pipi. The woman thought that Sang Sang was an ordinary friend of Tang Xiaotang, so she patted her on the shoulder and said with a smile, "What kind of nonsense is that? How much are a few vegetables worth?" Sang Sang noticed that the female vendor had just picked up some vegetable leaves, and there was still some muddy water in them. She couldn't help but frown. Tang Xiaotang hurriedly pulled the female vendor to her side and said a few words to her with a smile. She then looked at Sang Sang and said nervously, "Please don't be angry." Sang Sang said, "I just don't understand why the poorer the people are, the more stingy they are with money." Tang Xiaotang couldn't help but laugh when she thought of how stingy Sang Sang was when she was still a human. Sometimes, when you like something so much, you want to express your kindness by doing this. Sang Sang thought for a moment and said, "Just like the Taoist believers who dedicate their wealth and lives to me?" Tang Xiaotang said, "Almost, but still a little bit different." Sang Sang asked, "What's the difference?" Tang Xiaotang thought for a moment and said, "Like and awe?" Sang Sang suddenly felt a little unhappy. Then she suddenly found that she actually began to care about being liked by others, so she became even more unhappy. The basket was filled with vegetables. Tang Xiaotang wanted to pay, but the female vendor firmly refused. Walking out of the vegetable shop, Sang Sang said, "You haven't answered my previous question." "Why?" Tang Xiaotang stretched out her empty hand and held her hand. She looked at her and said sympathetically, "You have been to so many places with Ning Quebec, haven't you figured it out yet?" Sang Sang said, "It's different. If he dies, I will die too, so I have to follow him." Tang Xiaotang said with a smile, "In fact, it's the same. If he dies, I don't want to live either." Sang Sang thought for a moment and said, "Human beings are really stupid." Tang Xiaotang said, "In fact, sometimes it's quite happy to be stupid." Sang Sang looked at her hand and said, I am very unhappy that you sympathize with me. I am also unhappy that you touched my body. So I don't understand why I should be happy about being stupid. Tang Xiaotang said with a smile, it's not a good thing for the Academy or the Enlightenment doctrine that you are alive. But I am very happy to see that you are still alive. Maybe this is the happiness brought by stupidity. The two women went to buy vegetables and had a heart-to-heart talk. The three men in the shabby house looked at each other in silence. It was good to know that they were all alive. As for how they survived, it really didn't matter. Chen Pipi looked at Ning Ke and asked worriedly, is she willing to go back to Chang'an with you? Ning Ke shook his head and said, she didn't say, but she is getting closer and closer to Chang'an. Chen Pipi said, does she know what the Academy wants to do? Ning Ke said, the headmaster said that Haotian knows everything. Chen Pipi was silent for a moment and said, if so, you have no chance of winning. Ning Ke looked at the blue sky and white clouds outside the window and said, the headmaster also said that there are many things in this world that you will do even if you know it's impossible to do. Chen Pipi said, youngest uncle is such a person, and so is the headmaster. You and I may grow into such people in the future, but it won't affect her, because she is not a human at all. Ning Ke said, I hope she can make her own choice. Chen Pipi said, no one will make a choice that will destroy themselves. Ning Ke laughed and said, you just said that she is not a human. Chen Pipi said, even so, what will you do? Ning Ke's emotions became a bit complicated. He said, I hope I can find a way by then. The original method seems to be not feasible now. Chen Pipi said, can't we fix the God-stunning array without her? Ning Ke said, whoever started the trouble should untie it. She destroyed the God-stunning array with her footsteps and aura when she lived in Chang'an for years. Now we need her to do it again. Chen Pipi looked at him quietly and said, I only hope you won't regret it by then. If you want to regret, it's better to do it now. When it comes to it, you can't avoid it no matter what. Ning Ke said, I left Chang'an and went to Peach Mountain to pick her up because I was mentally prepared. If I really need to make a choice on that day, it's actually very simple. Chen Pipi heard the hidden determination in his words and sighed without saying anything. Yi Su did not say anything. He looked at the streets and the sky outside the window quietly with a clear smile on his thin face. His pale face was washed by the light and looked extremely gentle. He suddenly said, competing with heaven is only calculating oneself. Ning Ke looked at him and asked sincerely, so we don't need to do anything? Yi Su turned around and said with a smile, doing your own thing well is more important than anything else. As the saying goes, Haotian belongs to Haotian, and the human world belongs to the human world. What does it matter? Haotian belongs to Haotian, and the human world belongs to the human world. That was his Taoism. Ning Ke seemed to understand and asked again, the West Hill Divine Palace will definitely not allow you to continue preaching. Even the sword garret can't protect you all the time. What are you going to do next? Yi Su said, Lingang City is getting better. I'm going to leave. It was the first time Chen Pipi knew that his senior brother was going to leave Lingang. He was very surprised. Are you going to Chang'an? Ning Ke was also surprised. He thought that since the West Hill Divine Palace would not allow Yi Su to continue preaching, only the Tang Empire could provide him with a place to preach after he left the South Jin Kingdom. As I said, the Tang Empire is too good, and the human world is too bad. Yi Su said calmly, since I want to experience the suffering of the human world and save it, I naturally have to go to those places where there is real suffering and get to know the people who are suffering. The sunlight passed through the window and fell on him. His thin clothes seemed to be shining. The chopsticks in his bun seemed to be more beautiful than the most expensive ebony. Ning Ke suddenly said, do you still remember the first time we met? Yi Su shook his head. Years ago at the foot of Tianqi Mountain in the wilderness, he and Ning Ke met for the first time. At that time, he was still a proud Taoist wayfarer. He was the eldest brother and had no impression of Ning Ke at all. "I was very impressed by you." Ning Ke looked at him and said, "I have never seen a person so lonely." It seemed that his feet were not standing on the ground of the human world, but in another world. He was obviously alive, but it seemed that he had been dead for many years. This is not accurate. I should say that you seemed to be alive and dead in my eyes at that time. I felt sorry for you. Yi Su laughed and said, "Should be more pitiful now." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "No. Although you are not as powerful as you used to be, and you are pale and weak, almost disabled, you are not pitiful at all. Because you will become a sage." Yi Su said, "A sage only appears in 1,000 years. You have gone too far." Ning Ke said, "If you can make everyone a sage, you will naturally be a sage." At this moment, the door of the shabby house was pushed open. Tang Xiaotang carried a vegetable basket and said happily, "Look at how many vegetables Sang Sang and I have brought back. Don't eat leftovers." The dinner was very simple, mainly with green vegetables, because there were indeed a lot of green vegetables. In order not to let Haotian feel cheated, Chen Pipi went to the butcher's shop to cut a piece of streaky pork and made a bowl of cabbage and meat slices. Then he went next door and took 2 barrels of light wine. Meat and wine were the best to liven things up. Soon, the atmosphere in the shabby house became lively. Ning Ke was not a good drinker and was already drunk. With the help of the wine, he pulled paper and ground ink, and wrote half of the epigraph of the shack. Mountains are not famous because there are immortals. Waters are not deep because there are dragons. This is a shabby house, but only my virtue is fragrant. Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and looked at the calligraphy quietly. She suddenly asked, "Who am I?" Ning Ke said angrily, "Why do you ask me such a philosophical question?" Sang Sang pointed at the word "I" on the paper. Ning Ke finally understood. He pointed at Yi Su and was about to speak, but suddenly realized that since she asked this question, she must have some expectations. So he changed the topic and said, "I am not talking about me." "Then who are you?" "I am you, and you are me." "Who do you think I am talking about?" Although Sang Sang knew he was lying, she was still satisfied. Chen Pipi was very dissatisfied and said sadly, "When I first read this sentence, I thought you were still so shameless and arrogant. After listening to your explanation, I found that you have become so depraved." Ning Ke was furious and said, "I don't have guts." "So what?" They said goodbye. Sang Sang naturally could not stand such vulgarity, so she stood in the distance with her hands behind her back. Chen Pipi looked at Ning Ke and said, "Take care." "I will." "Just look at her. She is not light, but extremely heavy." Ning Ke replied with a smile and walked to Sang Sang. Sang Sang suddenly turned around and looked at Yi Su, saying, "You will be burned to death." At this time, the twilight was thick, and the afterglow was like blood and fire. Yi Su stood in the twilight, as if in fire. I ran back happily and finally made it before midnight. It's so good. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 934. In the twilight, Chen Pipi and Tang Xiaotang looked at Yi Su uneasily. They did not know what to say. Haotian's instructions were like prophecies. God's calculation was never wrong. So who could jump out? Yi Su knelt down and bowed to Sang Sang. There was no nervousness on his face, only calmness. Today's meeting was very important for his preaching. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked away in the twilight. When they were out of Lingang, Ning Kai could not help but say something. He shook his head helplessly and asked, "Can't you say something auspicious?" Sang Sang said, "I'm telling the truth." Ning Kai said angrily, "That's why it's not auspicious." Sang Sang ignored him and walked to the north with her hands behind her back. No one knew what would happen to Yi Su in the end. Sang Sang might be omniscient, but she had miscalculated many things and people related to Ning Quebec. Looking back at the city of Lingang under the setting sun, Ning Kai remained silent. The big black horse galloped out of the mountains, neighing joyfully. Someone preached in Lingang without the permission of the divine halls of West Hill. At first, it did not alarm the divine halls of West Hill. It was not until they found out who the preacher was and that the preacher had more and more followers that they became serious, especially when they found that the preaching content was almost blasphemous. Behind the curtain of Haotian's divine hall, the hierarch was still tall. But his waving arms and thundering roars showed that he was very angry. Long Qing stood at the stone steps in front of the curtain, looking at the hundreds of divine priests and deacons kneeling in front of him. He looked calm. He knew that the hierarch's anger was not only because Yi Su was preaching in Lingang, but also because of the Peach Mountain's seemingly peaceful but actually turbulent situation. The hierarch was now in an awkward and dangerous situation. In the name of Haotian, the divine hall of judgment began to carry out a bloody purge within Haotian Taoism. In less than 20 days, people from countless Taoist temples in various countries were arrested. The Yu prison was now overcrowded, and most of these people were the trusted followers of the hierarch. The woman on the seat of heavenly black jade had already unsheathed her Taoist sword. No one understood why she suddenly attacked the hierarch, but no one would misjudge the situation. The hierarch was the master of the West Hill Divine Palace and had been in charge of the secular world of Haotian Taoism for decades. Naturally, he had a strong foundation. In the face of the attack from the Divine Hall of Judgment, he should have made a stronger counterattack, or even directly suppressed them. However, this time, the hierarch seemed to be helpless. This was because the Abbey Dean had left the Jishou Abbey and came to the Peach Mountain. More importantly, the purge of the Divine Hall of Judgment was the will of Haotian. Hundreds of divine priests and deacons received the order and left. The Divine Hall of Haotian gradually became quiet. As for how these people would break through the blockade of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom and enter Lingang, that was something they had to consider. If they dared to express their doubts now, they would face the wrath of the hierarch. Long Qing bowed to the hierarch behind the light screen and left the Haotian Divine Hall. He walked silently on the cliff platform and walked into the dark Divine Hall of Judgment. Then he entered the Yu prison through the tunnel skillfully. The Divine Hall of Judgment and the Yu prison were heavily guarded, especially when Haotian Taoism was in turmoil. Everyone knew that the great Divine Priest of Judgment was making things difficult for the hierarch. Even people from the Divine Hall of Haotian could not enter. But Long Qing was an exception. It was not only because he was now the successor of the Jishou Abbey, but also because he had lived in this Divine Hall for a long time. He used to be the priest of the judicial department and had countless loyal subordinates. Now that Yi Hongyu was carrying out the purge, who would dare to stop him? The Yu prison was still as quiet as before. No sound could be heard from the cells on both sides of the dry tunnel. The divine priests and Taoists who had been captured and brought back to the Peach Mountain were already dying after being tortured by the judicial department. They could not even cry out in pain. They could only lie on dry straws and wait for death in despair. Although it was quiet, in fact, the Yu prison had not been so lively for a long time. Now, in the belly of Peach Mountain, hundreds of divine priests, Taoists, and deacons who had been escorted back from various countries by the judicial department were imprisoned. The dim light mixed with the smell of blood, making the atmosphere very depressing. Long Qing walked on the quiet mountain path with a calm expression. He did not feel depressed at all. Looking at the swaying light in front of him and smelling the smell of blood, he felt his heart begin to beat faster because of excitement. He wore an ordinary Taoist robe. There was a hole in his chest under the robe. His heart was beating in the hole. The surface of the Taoist robe rose and fell with it. The light was swaying, like the light waves on the South Sea. Long Qing pushed open the gate of a cell and walked to the bed. He looked at the old man covered in blood on the grass and said calmly, "Long time no see, divine priest Chu." Chu Fengqi was the chief red-robed great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace stationed in the Song Kingdom. He was the most loyal subordinate of the hierarch and had a very high status in Haotian Taoism. In the purge of the remnants of the Divine Hall of Light years ago, he was the most ruthless one. So now he became the most important target of the Divine Hall of Judgment. The Divine Sedan of Judgment went to the Song Kingdom in person. Yi Hongyu directly cut off Chu Fengqi's arms in the Taoist Hall and was dragged back to the Peach Mountain by the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall. He became a dead dog now, but the hierarch could do nothing about it. Chu Fengqi did not know how cruel the torture he had endured these days. But he did not see the hierarch coming to save him. He had long been disheartened and could only wait for the day of death. However, someone came to see him today. Chu Fengqi opened his eyes with difficulty and looked to the side of the bed. He found that it was a young Taoist who came to see him. The Taoist had several very sad scars on his face. He was the chief red-robed great divine priest of the Song Kingdom. How could he not know Long Qing? Prince Long Qing? Chu Fengqi was a little shocked and puzzled. Then he suddenly brightened because he thought of the relationship between Long Qing and Yi Hongyu. He also thought of Long Qing's current status in Haotian Taoism. Now even the hierarch lord chose to abandon him. If there was anyone else who could save him, it would be Long Qing and the Abbey Dean behind him. Chu Fengqi, who was already desperate, suddenly saw hope. He suddenly became spirited and his eyes were full of hope and begging. He hurriedly said, "Chu Fengqi is willing to dedicate his life and soul to the Abbey Dean and the prince. If I can return to the Song Kingdom, the Song Kingdom's Taoist temples and wealth will all be at the prince's disposal." In his opinion, Long Qing must have the intention to save and use him. But now, he had nothing else that could move him except the Song Kingdom's countless Taoist temples and his private wealth. Long Qing looked at him quietly and said, "Look at me." Chu Fengqi was a little puzzled and looked at his eyes. Long Qing's eyes were very normal, black and white. But when he looked at them, a strange change happened. The dividing line between the black pupil and the white pupil disappeared for some reason. The worlds on both sides of the line began to touch and then melt. The black pupil faded, the white pupil turned black, and the black and white mixed together. It was the gray of the beginning of chaos. Within a breath, Long Qing's eyes turned completely gray. Looking at the gray eyes, Chu Fengqi suddenly felt very scared and his body became extremely cold. He subconsciously wanted to turn his head and look away, but found that he could no longer control his body. Chu Fengqi's cheeks suddenly became thin, and the blood on his body gradually faded. He tried to make a sound but could not speak. He wanted to push Long Qing away, but his arms had already been cut off by Yi Hongyu. He could only feel everything in his body flowing out in despair. Indeed, nothing was left out. Chu Fengqi's life, spirit, cultivation state, and psyche were all taken away by Long Qing's gray eyes. In an instant, Chu Fengqi stopped breathing. Long Qing slowly closed his eyes and when he opened them again, his gray eyes had become black and white again. There was nothing special about them. No one knew that there was now another person in his body. His sea of consciousness had gained an extremely rich sense of perception and some brand new knowledge. He had become slightly stronger. On the haystack, Chu Fengqi's body was curled up and looked very miserable. He did not understand that what moved Long Qing was not the hidden wealth in the kingdom of song, but himself. Long Qing walked out of the cell calmly and came to the next cell. He pushed the door open and entered. Looking at the man on the bed, he said calmly, "Divine Priest Mu, long time no see." After a while, Long Qing walked out of the cell and went to the next cell. The quiet and terrifying process kept repeating. He had absorbed the cultivation of countless grassland powerhouses in the left king's palace of the East Wilderness, and his gray eyes had reached the advanced level. He did not stop until the early morning. The morning light came in through the stone window of the cell and fell on Long Qing's face. His expression was very calm, and his eyes were black and white. He looked like a young man with no distracting thoughts and a clear mind. The scars on his face were still there, and they did not fade because of the increase in his cultivation level. Instead, they became deeper, making him look very terrifying. He looked like the demonic gods in the murals in the divine temples. Long Qing looked at the morning light outside the window and sighed softly. Then he turned around and walked out of the U prison. When a powerhouse walked, he would take long breaths. As he breathed, the pink and wet heart and lungs in the hole in his chest kept pressing against each other, which looked very disgusting. However, in this dirty world of rotten flesh, there was a peach blossom looming and was about to bloom. The peach blossom was pure black for a while, and then golden for a while. No matter which color it was so holy. Long Qing walked out of the divine hall of judgment and came to the cliff yard. He walked to the inconspicuous stone houses by the cliff. Years ago in the wilderness, Yi Hongyu forcefully lowered her state in order to break the binding of Lotus. She was almost disabled and was treated coldly and humiliated by the divine halls of West Hill. That was why she chose to live in this stone house. Long Qing went to the stone house not to reminisce about the past, nor to prove how powerful he was to the woman who was not on the Peach Mountain. He went there because it was the Abbey Dean's residence on the Peach Mountain. The Abbey Dean was the real leader of Taoism. Especially when the hierarch did not dare to resist and chose to kneel in front of him, he should live in the highest divine hall of Haotian on the Peach Mountain. For some reason, the Abbey Dean did not sit in the divine hall of Haotian. Instead, he lived in the inconspicuous stone house by the cliff. He also did not interfere in the affairs of the divine halls of West Hill. Long Qing did not understand what the Abbey Dean was thinking. Since it was proven that the hierarch had a high state but a weak Taoist heart, why did the Abbey Dean not just remove him from the position of hierarch? In the secular world, the hierarch was still powerful. But on the Peach Mountain, the Abbey Dean had the absolute loyalty of Zhao Nanhai and the others from the South Sea. Together with those elders, Ning Ke and Ning Ke, they could easily expel the hierarch from the divine hall of Haotian. He stood in front of the stone house and thought for a while. He still could not figure it out. He shook his head and pushed open the old wooden door. With a shrill squeak, he walked into the dark world. It was very dim in the stone house. If one did not look carefully, he could not even see the face of the Abbey Dean in the wheelchair. As for the middle-aged priest behind the wheelchair, he seemed to be one with the darkness. The Abbey Dean coughed slightly and was about to drink some water. The middle-aged priest's hand was always on the back of the wheelchair. Long Qing quickly stepped forward and picked up the kettle from the stone table. He filled a bowl with water and handed it to the Abbey Dean respectfully. The Abbey Dean seemed to be more energetic after drinking the water. He looked at Ning Ke and asked, "Are you confused?" Long Qing did not dare to hide it. He told him all his questions. The Abbey Dean did not explain in detail. He said calmly, "The great divine priest of judgment is doing what you want to do. If so, why are you so anxious?" Long Qing understood. But he still did not understand why Yi Hongyu would launch such a strong attack on the hierarch. Now it seemed that the Abbey Dean had already known the hidden reason. The Abbey Dean suddenly asked, "What do you think of Yi Su?" Long Qing thought about it carefully and said, "My senior brother is very talented." The Abbey Dean nodded slowly and said, "Yes. Your senior brother does have a rare talent in Taoism. I used to think that his talent was inferior to Pippi. Now I think I was wrong." Long Qing thought that his senior brother had become a useless man. The Abbey Dean must not be referring to his cultivation state. He must be talking about his recent preaching in Lingang City. The hierarch is very angry. He has sent people to Lingang City to investigate. He said, "But in my opinion, my senior brother has only been preaching for a short time. Most of his followers are stupid and stubborn. There is no need to worry." The Abbey Dean looked at the thin booklet in his hand and said, "I wanted to sharpen your senior brother into the sharpest sword in Haotian Taoism. Unfortunately, his sword was destroyed by Jun Mo before the Verdant Canyon. I didn't expect that he would enter another realm because of this and might even achieve something beyond my imagination." The thin booklet was copied by someone sent by the Divine Halls of West Hill to Lingang City. It recorded all the content of Yi Su's preaching. The sentences were simple and the principles were simple. But even the Abbey Dean was shaken. This chapter has 4,000 words. There are more copies today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 935. It was very quiet in the stone house. Long Qing looked at the booklet in the Abbey Dean's hand and wanted to say something. But the words that came out of his mouth were far from what he wanted to say. The Verdant Canyon is not open. It is difficult for the Tangs to go south. The Qinghe River is in the north. The South Jin Kingdom is isolated. Liu Bai is no longer in the Sword Garret. No one can protect Lingang. If you want, I can kill them anytime. There is no hurry. Let's wait until the important matter is settled. The Abbey Dean said, "We have an honored guest today. Stand aside and don't miss any enlightenment." Long Qing was a little shocked. Now that the headmaster of the academy had left the human world, Liu Bai was dead, and the chief monk of scripture never left the Xiankong temple, who else in the world could be called an honored guest by the Abbey Dean? At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the stone house. The sound was very messy and without any rhythm. It seemed that the person had not been a guest for a long time, or was drunk. Long Qing opened the door with a harsh squeak. A breeze blew in his face with the intoxicating smell of wine and a middle-aged man in an ordinary robe. The middle-aged man looked very ordinary. He had wrinkles but did not look old. He had silver hair but did not look old. His skin was more delicate than a young girl's and his black hair was darker than a newborn's. It was impossible to tell his age. Or rather, it was a man without age. Long Qing was slightly stunned. Suddenly he thought of something. His pupils shrank and the peach blossom in his chest began to bloom. He was ready to fight with all his might. This man was not from the divine halls of West Hill. He could enter the Peach Mountain and come to the Cliff Plateau without any reaction from the powerhouses of the divine halls. It could only mean one thing. This man was in the limitless state. The next moment, Long Qing's eyes suddenly calmed down. The raging psyche power all went back to his sense of perception. The peach blossom in his chest slowly fell down and retracted its petals. Because the middle-aged man took off the flagon on his belt and began to drink. He drank very boldly, like a tornado on the sea. He did not put down the flagon, but the wine kept pouring out. This man was in the limitless state. The limitless state and the limitless state were the great divine powers of cultivation above the 5 states. Long Qing finally met the Abbey Dean who could do both in the past 1,000 years. In the face of such a powerful figure, Long Qing knew that there was no point in risking his life, so he calmed down. At the same time, he guessed that this was the distinguished guest that his teacher had mentioned. "Senior, please." The drunkard walked into the stone house with a flagon in one hand and the other behind his back. He looked up at the layout of the stone house and mocked, "I haven't been to the West Hill for a long time. I didn't expect Taoism to be so weak." His voice was still as old as before, like old bricks rubbing against each other. It was so ear-piercing that it seemed to pierce right into everyone's heart. Long Qing's face became a little pale. He felt that his ocean of qi and mountain of snow was showing signs of instability and collapse because of the other party's words. He forced himself to take a deep breath and finally stabilized his Taoist heart and ocean of qi and mountain of snow with great difficulty with the help of the extremely overbearing psyche power. The drunkard turned around and looked at him. He was surprised that the young Taoist could calm down on his own. He said, "I take back what I said. The young Taoists are stronger than I thought." The Abbey Dean was now a cripple, but he did not seem to be affected by the drunkard's voice. He looked at Long Qing and said with a smile, "Yes, he has made great progress these years." The drunkard looked at the middle-aged Taoist behind the wheelchair and said, "You are even better." The middle-aged Taoist smiled and said, "Thank you." This middle-aged Taoist was very ordinary, so ordinary that he was easily forgotten and covered by the darkness. He had no reputation in Haotian Taoism or the world. Even the hierarch and Long Qing only knew that he was the Abbey Dean's junior brother and a cultivator in the Knowing Destiny state, but they did not even know his name. He seemed to be a nameless person. However, in the past decades, the Abbey Dean was forced to the South Sea by the headmaster and did not dare to set foot on land. In fact, he was in charge of all the affairs of the Jishou Abbey and even Taoism. How could a person who could do so many things quietly and peacefully be ordinary? Ordinary people could not tell, but the drunkard was able to tell that he was not ordinary. The middle-aged Taoist did not care about fame. But as a cultivator, he could never be truly peaceful. Therefore, he was very satisfied with the drunkard's evaluation. "Of course, you are the best." The drunkard looked at the Abbey Dean in the wheelchair and said, "I have to admit that if you were in your best condition, even the butcher and I together would not be able to defeat you." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "It's all in the past." The drunkard changed the topic and said, "So I don't understand. You are already a useless person. Why do you still dare to invite me here? Aren't you afraid that I will kill you?" He had praised Long Qing and the middle-aged Taoist hiding in the darkness. But it was just a compliment. If he wanted to, he could still kill the 3 people in the stone house. "If I am not wrong, Haotian should have gone to the small town to find you too. That is why you appeared outside Chang'an. Taoism has a chance to breathe thanks to you." The Abbey Dean looked at him and said with a smile, "So, why do you want to kill me?" The meaning of this sentence was clear. "Since we are both working for Haotian, why do you want to kill me?" The drunkard stared into his eyes and said, "If you were not a useless person, you might be qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as me. But now you are just a bunch of ants. Haotian will not care if I kill you." The Abbey Dean said calmly, "If the divine kingdom cannot be reopened, you will also be an ant." The drunkard's expression changed slightly. He did not expect this half-useless person to know such a secret. He said coldly, "You ants can't do anything about the heavenly dome." The Abbey Dean said, "I heard that when the chief monk preached, there were countless flying ants bathing in the light. Although they did not fly to the heavenly dome, they burned into countless flames like the gate to the nirvana." The chief monk in this sentence was naturally the chief monk of scripture of the Xiankong temple. The drunkard understood what he meant. He frowned and said, "You are so arrogant. I wonder why Haotian thinks you are pious." The Abbey Dean said, "Haotian's view of the world will not be affected by the behavior of the world." The drunkard said, "I am not Haotian. I will be affected." I want to kill you even more now. The Abbey Dean asked, why do you want to kill me? The drunkard said, because your arrogance frightens me. Besides, I do not need a reason to kill. The Abbey Dean said calmly, you don't have to pretend to be arrogant. Because it does not work on me. I know you are not Kuharan or Lu Bai. You are just a man who loves to drink. The drunkard looked slightly serious and said, in your eyes, what kind of person am I? Gluttony for wine is the desire to indulge, gluttony for meat is the desire of the tongue. What the two of you cultivate is desire. Human desire is so strong, so indestructible, that you can endure the endless night. But it is also because you cultivate desire that you are so cowardly. The desire to live is too strong, so naturally you are afraid of death. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said with a smile, you said you have not been to the West Hill for a long time. I know it is a lie. Because you have never stepped into the West Hill Divine Kingdom. Because you dare not. You are afraid of being seen by Haotian. The drunkard's expression became serious. The Abbey Dean continued, according to the doctrine of Haotian Taoism, human's desire is the original sin. You and the butcher are even more sinful. But since Haotian has agreed to cleanse you of your sins, I think you should not be as timid as you have been for countless years. The drunkard said coldly, but what you are going to do is against her will. The Abbey Dean shook his head and said, you are wrong. The drunkard asked, what is wrong? Let's talk about desire. Together with the cause and effect mentioned by Buddhism, we can see the truth of most things. We can see what everyone wants. What Xiong Chumo wants is glory and fame in the secular world. For that, he doesn't care about anything else. What he wants is power. He glanced at Long Qing and then at the drunkard and said, you and the butcher want eternal life. But Haotian wants to go back to the divine kingdom. Maybe she will forget about it. As her followers, we have to remind her about it. If she really can't remember it, we have to find a way to send her back. The drunkard said, so it is not against her will? The Abbey Dean said, correct. The drunkard was silent for a long time. He looked at the Abbey Dean and sighed, I have never met someone as strange as you. Forgive me for not being able to keep you company. The Abbey Dean said calmly, you have to. The drunkard said sarcastically, for countless years, Taoism has never dared to mess with me. Has it changed now? The Abbey Dean asked, what about Haotian? The drunkard said, if she told me herself, it would be one thing. But it is another if you guess her thoughts. Besides, your thoughts may go against her will. The Abbey Dean said, you can have a look first and then bring a message for me. The drunkard frowned slightly and asked, to whom? The Abbey Dean said slowly, the journey to the west is long. I can't move around now. I have to trouble you. The drunkard finally confirmed his thoughts. He said with a changed expression, you are too bold. There is no hope. Even though she is much weaker now, she is still Haotian. How many people have gone against heaven's will in the past? Even the headmaster of the academy was defeated by her, not to mention you and me. You are wrong. This is not going against heaven's will. It is, the Abbey Dean said calmly, enforcing justice on behalf of heaven. Preaching to heaven. If heaven does not speak, what should we do? If heaven does not agree, what should we do? If heaven does not agree, what should we do? Float on the sea? These were not the Abbey Dean's choices. His choice was very firm. Since heaven does not agree, then I will enforce justice on behalf of heaven. As long as I follow the heaven's way, then heaven cannot say I am wrong. There is more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 936. The drunkard looked at the Abbey Dean as if he was an idiot and said in a trembling voice, "You are crazy." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "No, I have never been so sober." The drunkard frowned and said, if she can't go back to Haotian's divine kingdom, and you choose to uphold justice for her, what will happen to the world?" The door of the stone house was not closed. The Abbey Dean looked at the clear sky outside the cliff plateau and said, "The world will still be the same, because everyone including you seems to have forgotten one thing." The drunkard asked seriously, "What is it?" The Abbey Dean raised his right hand and pointed at the sky. "Haotian is in the human world, but Haotian is also in the sky." The drunkard understood and kept silent. "I know you will eventually agree." The Abbey Dean looked at him and said calmly, "If she stays in the human world, how can you achieve immortality?" The drunkard asked confusedly, "You said that everything in the world depends on what everyone wants." "I want immortality." "What about you? What exactly do you want?" "I want immortality," the Abbey Dean said. The drunkard savored the two words and felt the infinite desire. The Abbey Dean said again, "Immortality is the only way to achieve immortality. Any change will eventually lead to the end." This was the fundamental conflict between the Academy and Taoism. The drunkard knew it very well. He frowned and said, "Even if it is a pool of stagnant water?" The Abbey Dean said, "You and I live here. Countless ancestors and descendants will live here. There are green trees and blooming peach blossoms. Who can say it is a pool of stagnant water?" The drunkard said, "I don't think this will convince the headmaster." The Abbey Dean said, "Even if it is a pool of stagnant water, it is still eternal." The drunkard said, "I want immortality because I want to live." "Is immortality really so important?" The Abbey Dean said after a long silence, "I have been thinking about this since I realized Taoism. I found that I can't accept a world without immortality." It was quiet in the stone house. Only his voice kept echoing, as if he was trying to wake up every bird in the Peach Mountain and every flower in the Divine Hall. If everything is going to end, then what is the meaning of everything that has existed in time? Every time I think of this possibility, I feel incomparable despair. Don't you feel despair as well? The Abbey Dean looked at the drunkard and asked seriously. At the same time, he was also asking his younger brother and Long Qing in the room. He was also asking everyone in the world, including the headmaster and those in the academy. The drunkard felt a little bitter. He did not know how to answer the question, because when he thought about it carefully, he found that there was a great horror hidden in it. The horror was so great that he did not dare to think further. He asked, "What about yourself? If you can't be eternal with heaven and earth?" The Abbey Dean said, "Everyone is a part of heaven and earth. As long as heaven and earth are immortal, so will we." The drunkard asked, "Even without your own subjective consciousness?" The Abbey Dean said, "It must be gratifying to know the immortal." The drunkard shook his head and said, "Your thoughts have deviated from the original meaning of life." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "Isn't this the purpose of our cultivation? Life is a cultivation." Ning Ke had forgotten where this saying came from. But because he always felt that this saying was too pretentious to the point of being noble and elegant, he never forgot it. As Sang Sang traveled the world, she crossed great rivers and mountains and met many strangers and old friends. He suddenly realized that this saying was very reasonable. Then he realized that he had mixed up the two sayings, life is a journey and life is a cultivation. The scenery on the journey kept changing, so did his mood. After leaving Lincoln, bypassing the Great Swamp and entering the Tang Empire along the south of Yen, Ning Ke was in a very good mood. He was finally home. The green fields were so beautiful, and the smell of manure in the wind was not so pungent. People behaved differently when they were in a good mood. Ning Ke's habit was to do the same simple thing over and over again, as if that was the only way to express the joy in his heart. For example, he would write on the ground with a branch, or grind on the whetstone with a hatchet, or hum parts of a song over and over again. He rode on the big black horse and held Sang Sang in his arms. Although it was difficult for him to hold her tightly because of her figure, it did not affect his mood. "Hey, Jude, la 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 la," he only remembered the first line of this song from his previous life. He repeated it for another reason other than joy. The more he sang, the happier he became. Even his eyebrows flew up as if he was dancing. Sang Sang did not have any reaction at first, but as she listened to him singing this song, her face became more and more gloomy, as if her cheeks were wet with dew. This situation lasted for a long time. No matter how slow Ning Ke was, he finally noticed her displeasure. He moved forward and looked into her eyes. He asked confusedly, "What's wrong?" Sang Sang said, "I don't like being called a black pig." Ning Ke then realized it. He held back his urge to laugh and said, "You are so white now. How could they be talking about you? Don't be so sensitive, okay?" Sang Sang said, "I'm not happy because you are still thinking about the black in the past." The misunderstanding because of the song was after all just a small episode in the journey. The two rode on the big black horse all the way to the east. They saw wild rape flowers and colorful farmhouses. Finally, they arrived at Chang'an. The majestic city rose into the clouds and was unparalleled. Many years ago, when they returned from the city of Wei to the south and saw the majestic city, they had a lot of emotions. But now they were very calm because they had lived here for a long time. Ning Ke was actually a little excited because he had brought Haotian home. "I didn't say we were going to the city." Sang Sang's words were like a basin of ice water, drenching his heart. He thought about it and said, "I really have no reason to ask you to go to the city." Haotian had come to the human world. If there was anything that could threaten her safety, it would be the God-stunning array in Chang'an. Even if it was incomplete, it still made her vigilant. They came to the pavilion beside the state highway and looked at the majestic city in the distance. He was silent for a long time and then asked, "If this is not the end of this journey, where is it?" Sang Sang said, "If this is the end of your journey, then you can leave." Ning Ke was silent. It was not until they returned to Chang'an that he realized the war between Haotian and the human world was far from over. The journey would continue. He could threaten her with suicide and ask her to go to Chang'an with him. But he did not want to do that because it was meaningless and it did not mean victory. The day when Sang Sang was willing to go to Chang'an was the day of victory. The pavilion was 10 miles away from the city. Ning Ke looked at 10 miles away and seemed to be able to see the old black brick city wall. Then he saw the city gate slowly open and a scholar holding the hand of a youth walked out. It was eldest brother who was still wearing a cotton-padded jacket in the warm spring day. The academy protected the country. The youth held by eldest brother was naturally the current emperor of the Tang Empire. The young emperor was handsome and his eyes were very straight. But at this moment, he was a little confused. "Teacher, why did we leave the palace and come here?" Eldest brother said gently, "I brought you to see two people." The young emperor looked into the distance on the state highway and did not see anyone. He knew that Chang'an had been under martial law since 10 days ago. Since last night, the city gate had been closed and no one was allowed to enter or leave. "Teacher, who are we going to see? Does it have anything to do with the tense atmosphere in the palace? Are they the enemies? Enemies of Haotian Taoism or the national master of the Golden Palace?" The eldest senior brother smiled and said, "They are two very interesting people. The woman is learning how to become a human, or learning how to refuse to become a human, while the man is doing something more difficult. He wants to make her like being a human and teach her how to become one." Thinking of the rumors in the palace, the young emperor vaguely understood and became nervous. He subconsciously clenched his teacher's hand and said, "Youngest uncle is back." Eldest brother said, "Yes, your youngest uncle is back. Your father and mother have entrusted Chang'an and the country to him, and he has never disappointed anyone. He has temporarily put his life and the things that he cherishes more than his life behind him and is working hard." The young emperor withdrew his hand and solemnly bowed to the distance. Eldest brother looked at the pavilion and thought, "Youngest brother, I brought His Majesty here for you to see. Chang'an is just like yesterday. Don't worry about him. Just do your best and don't force yourself." He held the young emperor's hand and walked back into the city. The city gate was not closed. Dozens of green-skinned men in cyan clothes and pants pulled a black carriage out of the gate with very strong ropes. It seemed to be very difficult. After a long time, the black carriage was dragged to the pavilion. Mr. Qi and dozens of brothers of the Fish Dragon gang knelt down and kowtowed to Sang Sang. Then they looked at Ning Kai with a smile and turned to Chang'an. Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary and his wife were also among the crowd. Mrs. Zheng walked to the pavilion and looked at Sang Sang's back. She had mixed feelings and could not connect this tall woman with her daughter. Ning Kai said to Sang Sang, "You have to return some of the worldly karma." Sang Sang turned to Mrs. Zheng and said expressionlessly, "I grant you immortality." Ning Kai felt helpless and thought, "What do you think immortality is? Cabbages?" Mrs. Zheng did not hear clearly what she said. Hearing the familiar voice, her heart trembled and she subconsciously took 2 steps forward. She felt that Sang Sang's aura was so familiar. Without hesitation, she grabbed Sang Sang's sleeves and held her tightly in her arms. She cried in a trembling voice, "My son, what's wrong with you?" Sang Sang frowned and was a little unhappy. Ning Kai looked at her and thought, "If you came to the human world for cultivation, then the hugging and crying in the spring breeze pavilion is an experience that you can't avoid." Sang Sang knew what he was thinking. It was not that she guessed or calculated, but she really knew what he was thinking. She heard his voice and then she quieted down. She quietly let Mrs. Zheng hug her and let her hot tears wet her flowery cyan clothes. Her face was expressionless and no one knew if she had realized something. 3 chapters with 10,000 words. Is this a small weekend surprise? There will be more surprises in the future. Please look forward to it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 937. Since they were leaving the pavilion, there was bound to be a farewell. Zheng Jing comforted his wife in his arms. His wife turned around from time to time and looked at Sang Sang in the pavilion with teary eyes. Sang Sang was still expressionless. She looked down at the tears left by Zheng Jing's wife on her clothes. The tears quickly disappeared and no trace could be found. Ning Kai looked at the magnificent city in the distance and thought, how can there be a perfect way to live up to both Chang'an and Qing? On a threshing ground in a village dozens of miles south of the city, the drunkard slowly put down his flagon and looked somewhere with mixed emotions. He was sad and confused. On the cliff plateau of Peach Mountain countless miles south of the city, the Abbey Dean sat in a wheelchair and looked at the blue sky outside the stone window. He sighed with emotion and said, "It seems that Haotian really needs our help." Long Qing asked, "What do we need to do?" The Abbey Dean said, "Haotian knows very well what we should do. What we need to do is to prepare her for the future and welcome her arrival." The city gate of Chang'an was closed and there was no one around. It looked very lonely, but no one knew that at this moment, countless eyes were looking at the farewell pavilion in the south of the city. Sang Sang knew that many people were looking at her and waiting for her decision. But she did not care. She was Haotian, and no matter what she did not need to explain to human beings. The big black horse pulled the heavy black carriage consciously. Ning Ke walked into the carriage and found that the academy had prepared everything he needed. He took out something from a secret compartment and inserted it into the intersection of the talisman lines on the carriage wall. As a very faint light appeared, the talisman array on the wall of the carriage was instantly activated. The carriage made of iron and steel turned into a hair on the dust. When Sang Sang walked into the carriage, he was packing his luggage, the black arrow case, the black iron cutlass, the black umbrella, and the black carriage. It really looked like a world of night. The black carriage drove through the straight and spacious official road, past the tombs of Yen Sei and Wei Guangming, past the dry reeds that looked like wheat seedlings in spring, and came to the green meadow. Behind the green meadow was a towering mountain. In front of the mountain was a unique and elegant building. In front of the building was a newly repaired stone archway, from which came the sound of reading. "Do you want to go back to the academy?" Ning Ke looked at the familiar house and asked Sang Sang. Sang Sang didn't say anything and just shook her head. Suddenly, the sound of studying in the classroom of the academy stopped for some reason. Then, two extremely clear and distant sounds of flute and zither played harmoniously, as if they were welcoming a distinguished guest. Ning Ke walked out of the carriage and saw senior brothers Ximen and Bei Gong, who were holding zither and flutes, seventh sister and the remaining senior brothers, Professor Huang He, and the female mathematics professor who was still wearing a blue gown today. Somehow, he felt his eyes moisten. Sang Sang sat in the carriage, quietly listening to the sounds of the zither and the flute. After a long time, she finally lifted the green curtain in front of the carriage and came to the meadow among the flowers and trees. Many students of the academy ran out and looked curiously and confusedly at the black carriage on the meadow, wondering who it was. It actually alarmed the entire academy. These ordinary students in the front yard were newly recruited this year. Ning Ke didn't know any of them, and no one knew him. He said to fourth brother, "I hope they can live longer." In the war against the Tang Empire 2 years ago, all the students of the academy, whether they were in the army or serving as officials in the harsh border commandery, suffered heavy casualties. He took Sang Sang to walk in the human world and endured endless pain and torture without giving up. Naturally, he didn't want such a thing to happen again. Fourth brother looked at him and said, "That depends on you, youngest brother." Ning Ke said, "Please rest assured, senior brother. I will try my best." Fourth brother nodded with relief and then turned to look at Sang Sang among the flowers and trees. He bowed deeply to the ground, and the disciples and instructors of the academy at the back of the mountain of the academy also bowed deeply to him. Although they were hostile to Haotian Taoism, most of the Tangs were believers of Haotian. Therefore, no matter where Sang Sang went, as long as they knew her identity, they would definitely bow to her and wish they could be as low as the dust. After all, the academy was the academy. It was natural for them to bow to Haotian, but they wouldn't kneel because they used to live with her and because Haotian was their enemy. When they bowed, they naturally couldn't play the zither or flute. The music had already stopped. Ximen Weiyang held the zither in his arms. When he straightened up, his eyes were already red. He stared at Sang Sang among the flowers and finally shed tears. He said, "Why are you still alive?" Sang Sang was still expressionless. She said, "I will never die." At this time, seventh sister had already spread the flower cloth on the meadow and was putting the prepared food on the cloth. Hearing this, she hurriedly said, "Let's eat first." They have to continue their journey. Just like in the shabby alley of Linkong City in the South Jin Kingdom, people who had lived in the academy would always think that eating was more important than anything, even if it was Haotian. Interestingly, Sang Sang still seemed to have the habit of living in the back of the mountain of the academy. Although she didn't say anything, she accepted Mu Yu's words and sat down beside the flower cloth. Ximen Weiyang wiped away the tears on his face and sat by her side. Picking up a pair of chopsticks, he placed all of the vinegar-soaked cabbage heads into his own bowl. Then, he continuously sent them into his mouth. Only when his cheeks were bulging did he remember that he should chew them a bit. He chewed hard, and the cabbage heads in vinegar made a crunching sound between his teeth. It was unknown whether it was too sour or something else, but he frowned and seemed to be in pain. Sang Sang was a little unhappy, which made Shimen Weiyang happy. He didn't care whether you were Haotian or not. As long as you thought about it, you would turn into ashes. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to eat happily today. The farewell meal was not the last meal, so there was no need to eat miserably. However, it was impossible to eat happily in such a situation. If it weren't for the fear that they would never see Ning Ke again, people in the back of the mountain of the academy wouldn't have invited Sang Sang to dinner. It was quite possible that they would treat her to a few cuts. The picnic among the grass and flowers soon ended. Sang Sang returned to the horse carriage, and the onlookers gradually dispersed. Ning Ke finished talking with his senior brothers and sisters and was about to leave. However, seventh sister Mu Yu pulled him aside and whispered something to him. Ning Ke couldn't help but frown when he heard what she said. "Which direction are we going?" he asked Sang Sang when he entered the carriage. Sang Sang said, "To the west." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke asked, "Why does everyone have to go to the west?" Sang Sang said, "Has Jun Mo gone there?" Ning Ke said, "Second brother is going to cultivate Buddhism." "Why are you going to Xiankong Temple?" Sang Sang didn't explain. Ning Ke thought of the lament he felt when he looked at Chang and city from afar. He vaguely felt that everything was destined. How could there be a perfect law in the world? Could it be Buddhism? The iron will rolled on the stone path among the meadows silently. The black horse carriage went to the west, as if it wanted to go back in time. Just as Ning Ke and Sang Sang set off, someone had already arrived in the west. In the extreme west of the wilderness, there was a boundless cliff. The cliff led to the bottom of the earth. It was extremely steep, spanning many miles. In the middle of the cliff was an extremely deep sinkhole, and at the bottom of the sinkhole was an extremely vast field. In the middle of the field was an extremely majestic mountain. If this mountain was on the ground, it might be higher than Tianqi Peak. However, because it was located in the sinkhole, one could only see the verdant peak from the ground. There were countless ancient trees on the giant peak, giving it a dense green. Hidden among the trees were countless yellow temples and Buddhist halls. These temples and Buddhist halls together formed the unknown place of Buddhism, Xiankong Temple. The drunkard stood on the edge of the cliff and looked at the giant peak in the distance. He looked at the peak that was parallel to his line of sight. After a long silence, the expression on his face gradually became cold. In terms of cultivation time, the Buddha was later than the drunkard and the butcher. However, in terms of the foundation he established in the human world and the state he reached, the Buddha was far better than the drunkard. As the Abbé Dean said, the drunkard and the butcher cultivated their desires, and they had cultivated to the extreme of human beings. But the Buddha cultivated himself, and when he reached nirvana, he had already surpassed human beings. When the Buddha was still preaching, the drunkard had never been to Xiankong Temple. After the Buddha reached nirvana, he had visited twice, but he had never entered, just like he had never entered the divine halls of West Hill. He had always felt a little uneasy. Looking at the yellow temples and halls among the peaks, the uneasiness in his heart became heavier and heavier. He vaguely felt that the Abbé Dean's thought had revealed an unimaginable truth. A clear and distant bell suddenly rang in a temple among the giant peaks. The bell rang through the forest and swept over the eaves. It took a long time for the bell to reach the wilderness beside the giant sinkhole and into his ears. There were two roads from Chang and to the western wilderness. One was to go straight west, cross the Pamir Mountains, enter the Yueluan Mountains, and then go straight up to the western wilderness. The other one was to go north to the wilderness, and then go straight west. Sang Sang said to go west, but did not say how. So Ning Kai chose to go north first, because there were many familiar sceneries and things along the way. He thought she would be touched. They went all the way north. The black horse carriage passed through Hebei County and went straight to Min Mountain. They passed by the road where he found her, and the forest where the old hunter used to live, but her expression did not change at all. Ning Kai was not disappointed. He believed that one day, Sang Sang would be touched by the memories, and her humanity would triumph over divinity, and she would become a real human being. At that time, he would be able to sing with her. Of course, they would not sing Black Pig, but the poem that was used to kill people. Ning Kai kept this optimistic thought, or hope, until the horse carriage passed through the northern mountain road and came to the familiar earthen city. Then he realized that everything had changed. Please allow me to wish Miss Dobe a happy wedding, and today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 938. It was late spring in the Central Plains, but the northern frontier fortress did not feel cold at all. Instead, it began to heat up earlier. The weather in recent years was as unpredictable as Haotian's mood. Along with the heat came the dryness. The border of the wilderness had always had little rain, and now it was even more dusty. Although the grass in the wilderness was stubbornly green, it was covered in dust and looked very ugly. It was even more so in the city of Wei. The mud walls were scratched by the northwest wind, and dust was flying everywhere. If it were in the past, the muddy veterans would be cursing on the shabby barracks, and the General Ma would be sighing at the muddy wine in his bowl. Now the dust was still flying, but those scenes could no longer be seen. There were traces of the war 2 years ago in the corners of the walls. The wind could cut the mud walls, but it could not erase the old black blood stains. The slightly astringent well had been filled with sand by the barbarians, and the shabby barracks had long collapsed. The dilapidated and abandoned town was uninhabitable, and there was no one in it. There was no one in the city of Wei, but there were people outside the city. Dozens of tents stood firm in the wind and sand. From time to time, prayers and incantations could be heard. The barbarians who were used to living in the wild seemed to be living happily. Although he was exposed to the scorching sun and strong wind, Ning Kai's face became paler and paler. He looked at the dead city in silence, and no one knew what he was thinking. Sang Sang's spirit was much better than before. She sat by the window, looking at the tents and feeling the pure spiritual power from the heart. She looked calm. After years of unremitting efforts of Haotian Taoism, the most powerful force in the wilderness, the Golden Tribe Royal Court, finally changed its original faith and bowed down to the divine light of Haotian. They worshipped the everlasting heaven, which was also Haotian, and also Sang Sang. The wind outside the city of Wei gradually stopped. A cloud floated in from nowhere and blocked the scorching sun. The wind from the depths of the wilderness also became much cooler. The barbarians walked out of their tents and enjoyed the rare comfort. Their faces were filled with cheerful smiles. Some pious elders kissed the ground and thanked Haotian for the blessing. Ning Kai looked back at Sang Sang and asked, "Your cloud?" Sang Sang did not answer him. She lifted the green curtain and got out of the carriage. She walked slowly in the tent, feeling the respect and love of the barbarians. Her eyebrows gradually relaxed, and the flowers on her green dress gradually bloomed. After leaving the West Hill Divine Palace, she had been to the Great River and the Lank Temple, as well as the South Jin Kingdom and the Tang Empire. She had never felt like this in those places. Only now did she feel like she was walking in her own world. The sun gradually set in the west, and the temperature became more and more pleasant. More and more barbarians came out of their tents. The women began to prepare dinner, and the men began to pile firewood for the night bonfire. It was very lively. No one could see Sang Sang and him. The barbarians around the tent suddenly cheered. Ning Kai turned around and saw a black herd of horses coming from the south of the city of Wei, driven by dozens of cavalrymen of the Golden Tribe. Looking at this scene, the emotions on his face became somewhat complicated. Those horses were not wild horses, but the handsome warhorses that the Tang Empire raised in the Xiangwan Plain. In the peace treaty signed by him, the Xiangwan Plain and the 7 stockade villages were all ceded to the Golden Tribe royal court. The Tang Empire had fewer warhorses, and it was difficult to replenish them. According to the plan of the West Hill Divine Palace, the Tang army would run out of warhorses in another 3 years. Even if the war started again, the Tang Empire would definitely lose. In other words, from the day the Tang Empire ceded the Xiangwan Plain, there was no way for the Tang Empire to make a comeback. There were 1,000 horses outside the city of Wei, which was the last batch of trophies harvested by the royal court. Naturally, the barbarians were in high spirits. The bonfire in the tents was suddenly enlarged, and the number of slaughtered sheep doubled. Some nobles even ordered their slaves to carry out countless jars of wine, which led to an even louder cheer. As the night approached, the bonfire was lit. All the barbarians came out of their tents and began to eat and drink around the bonfire. When they were drunk, they began to wrestle and play, and young men and women began to dance enthusiastically. Ning Kai stood outside and looked at the scene calmly. In fact, it took him a lot of effort to control himself from looking at the ruins of the city of Wei. The livelier the barbarian tribe was, the more deserted the earthen city was. The happier the barbarians were, the sadder the earthen city was. The brighter the bonfire was, the angrier the earthen city was. The big black horse sensed his mood and slowly lowered its head. At this time, Sang Sang had finished her tour of her world and walked back to the horse carriage. She looked at him and asked, "Are you very angry?" Ning Kai calmly said, "Yes, I am very angry." Sang Sang asked, "Why?" Ning Kai did not look at her and said, "This is a human emotion. It has nothing to do with you." Sang Sang said, "Although I am not a human, I can analyze this kind of emotion." Ning Kai said, "You won't understand." Sang Sang said, "Then you have to tell me." Ning Kai said, "I am angry because of these barbarians, but I am more angry because you are not angry. This makes me very sad and disappointed, and I even start to doubt my own thoughts." Sang Sang said, "Why should I be angry?" Ning Kai turned to look at her for a long time and said in a slightly cold voice, "You have lived here before." Sang Sang's expression did not change. She said, "I have lived in many places." Ning Kai stared at her eyes and said, "The people in the city of Wei used to love you so much." Sang Sang looked at the deserted earthen city in the night and was silent for a while. Then she pointed to the barbarians who were celebrating around the bonfire and said, "These people also love me very much." Ning Kai suppressed his anger and said, "How can it be the same?" Sang Sang said calmly, "They are all my people. I treat them the same." Ning Kai could no longer control his emotions and shouted angrily, "If you have not become an idiot, then you should be very clear that these people in the city of Wei died because of you." Sang Sang's expression still did not change, and the emotion in her voice was still so calm, or it could be said that there was no emotion at all. She said coldly, "Except this time? For countless years, human beings have long been used to killing each other in my name. Do I have to be responsible for every time?" Ning Kai looked at her eyes and said, "You also know, except this time." After saying this, he did not continue. He silently walked to the horse carriage and waved the horsewhip in the air. The whip was loud and clear, dispersing the cool night wind and the light from the bonfire. The horse carriage just drove past the tents and stopped again. Tonight, the moon was curved like a hook and was not bright. The night sky was dotted with stars. The starlight sprinkled on the wilderness, slightly illuminating the dark wilderness and a huge stone pile. There were dozens of wooden shelves in the stone pile. On the shelves were rotten corpses that had been dried by the wind. From the tattered clothes, it could be recognized that these dead people were all Tang soldiers. Ning Ke did not know whether this was the Golden Tribe royal court showing off after the war, or the extremely cruel torture of the scouts sent by the Tang army to the wilderness last year after being caught. His face was very calm, as if there was frost on it. With a clang, he unsheathed the iron cutlass and chopped at the stone pile from a distance of dozens of feet. The iron cutlass cut the wind silently, but one could faintly hear the fierce cry of a vermilion bird. With a bang, the stone pile was broken into two pieces. A raging flame shot out from the edge of the cutlass and fell on the stone pile. In an instant, the wooden shelves and the corpses of the Tang soldiers on the shelves were all burned into the cleanest ashes. Ning Ke put the cutlass back into the sheath. The horse carriage continued to move forward. He did not sit in the carriage, but sat on the shaft, listening to the friction between the wheels and the weeds. He looked at the night in silence. After a long time, Sangsang's voice sounded in the carriage. "I thought you would kill all the humans outside the city of Wei, or slowly roast them to death." Ning Ke did not look back and asked emotionlessly, "Will you stop me?" Sangsang said, "I don't know." Ning Ke said sarcastically, "Is there something that Haotian doesn't know?" Sangsang said, "Because there are some things that I suddenly don't want to calculate." Ning Ke gradually calmed down and even smiled as he thought of those valiant grassland men and those beautiful girls whose cheeks were roasted by the bonfire. "I said it in the imperial palace of Chang'an, in Qinghe prefecture, and in many other places. These people will all die. None of them will be left. So I am not in a hurry." The carnival around the bonfire, the dancing young men and women, the pious old men, and the ignorant teenagers who could already ride horses. If such a beautiful scene was destroyed, what kind of beauty would it be? Sangsang's voice was a little cold. "Do you think I will allow it?" Ning Ke said, "So I will defeat you first, and then kill them all." This journey was backtracking. One part of it was from the Lank Temple to Chang'an, and another part was from the city of Wei to the west. The same two people, the same black horse and the same black carriage. However, in those years, the sky was full of clouds and crows. Today, it was so quiet. After leaving the city of Wei, Ning Ke became much quieter. He talked less and less with Sangsang, and the time he spent staring at the green grassland became longer and longer. When passing by Shubi Lake, according to his original plan, he would definitely rest here for a night and let Sangsang relive some of the past. However, he suddenly changed his mind and continued to move through the night. Sangsang understood his emotional problem, but she did not care. At least Ning Ke could not see that she did not care. Moreover, what she had to consider was indeed more important. Haotian could calculate everything in the world. She calculated that there would be a very satisfactory result of this trip. However, when she was thinking about the green grassland, she once again confirmed that there was something she could not calculate. Because she could not calculate it, she had to see it with her own eyes. After seeing the world that belonged to her, she wanted to see people or things beyond the world, and then she left. There is still one chapter left today. I have to walk the dog now, so the update time may be late. Those who have to work or go to school tomorrow, don't wait. You can read it tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 939. Ning Ke was silent because of the negative emotions of disappointment and anger. Sangsang, who rarely spoke, was even quieter now. That was because they had left the barbarian settlement. The vast and desolate scenery was devoid of human habitation. The further they were from the human world, the further they were from the human world. The only difference was that they were far from the human world. They crossed the wilderness along the route they had taken before. When summer came, the black horse carriage also came to the edge of the swamp called Quagmire. The smell of wet rot and fog appeared in front of Ning, Quebec. If it was in the past, he would naturally feel that there were many dangers hidden in the fog of the swamp. But now he did not care at all, because Haotian was in the carriage, and because he knew who the master of the swamp was. The black horse carriage entered the fog, and the carriage emitted warm light. The light came from Sang Sang's body. It was not hot and dazzling, but extremely tough. No matter how wet and heavy the fog was, it could not stop the light from spreading endlessly. In just a moment, the fog around the horse carriage was swept away by the light, revealing the blue sky above and the true appearance of the swamp. There was mud everywhere, and the seemingly shallow water was covered with greasy green moss. No one knew how many terrible pools were hidden below, and it was impossible for ordinary people to walk out alive. It was not difficult for Ning Ke and Sang Sang. The black horse carriage was as light as a feather, and the wheels rolled over the water without leaving any marks, not even the moss. The sinister flood dragons in the pool and the strange beasts lurking in the water were peeping at their carriage from afar. Because of their lack of intelligence, they could not feel the power of Haotian, but they were instinctively afraid and did not dare to come close to provoke them. But the big black horse was still vigilant, for it did not want to be bitten. Ning Ke's iron cutlass suddenly became hot, and a bright red flame flowed out of the scabbard. It turned into a dark red vermilion bird in the air in front of the carriage, howling at a direction in the distant fog. The vermilion bird was the killing talisman of the god-stunning array. What could wake it up was naturally not the flood dragons or strange beasts, but a stronger enemy. It kept howling at the distant fog, looking extremely nervous. After entering the swamp, it was safe and sound. Ning Ke felt like a fox exploiting the tiger's might. At this time, when he saw the vermilion bird's intense reaction, he could not help but feel a little nervous and vigilant. Sang Sang was not nervous. She only felt that the vermilion bird's cry was a bit unpleasant and harsh. She reached out through the blue curtain and held its neck in the slightly stuffy wind. Then the cry stopped abruptly. The vermilion bird was a divine talisman at the peak of the knowing destiny state. Especially after it broke through its fear in the Battle of Chang'an and attacked the Abbey Dean, it became even more proud and confident. It would never be willing to bear such pressure. However, it did not dare to struggle in her hand. Its two eyes rolled around, looking very pitiful. The sound of hoofbeats could be faintly heard from the fog in the distance. After a very short period of time, the sound of hoofbeats quickly became clearer. It was as violent as rain, and the entire swamp began to shake uneasily. Ning Ke had been vigilantly looking in that direction. When he heard the violent hoofbeats, he suddenly relaxed, because he already knew who it was. Without the cover of the fog, everything in the swamp could be seen very clearly. When the fog in the distance was dispersed by the black shadow, what followed the dense sound of hoofbeats was an endless herd of wild horses. At the front of the herd, there were 8 rare horses pulling an extremely old carriage. The 8 horses were pulling an extremely shabby carriage, and in the old carriage sat a dark-skinned lazy donkey with snow-white lips. Gaga was here. With its lazy temperament, its king's carriage should be at the back of the herd of wild horses, and it should be lying on its back with its 4 hooves facing the sky. And with its gluttonous habit of the academy, it should be chewing the yellow fruits beside it, and not caring about what was happening between heaven and earth. But today, Gaga was very different. It did not even look at the basket of fruits on the shabby carriage. Its front hooves had already broken the dead wood in front of the carriage. Its eyes were red, and it was full of murderous intent as it rushed over with the herd of wild horses. Sang Sang lifted the curtain of the carriage and stood in front of the carriage expressionlessly. Looking at the horrifying herd of wild horses, her flowery indigo dress swayed in the wind, and she reached out to catch a gust of wind from the sky. Then she waved her hand, and the clouds in the blue sky were not disturbed. The wind raged in the swamp, and the stagnant water in the pond splashed around like a rainstorm, and countless mosses flew all over the sky. When the herd of wild horses suddenly encountered the power of heaven and earth, no matter how obedient they were, they could not help but be in a mess. And the 8 horses at the front were directly blown into the mud by the gust of wind, and they were covered with mud. The shabby carriage fell on the ground and broke into countless pieces. The basket of yellow fruits was shaken into a mixture of juice and flock, and the black donkey was shaken into the sky. Gaga! Gaga! An angry and manic cry came from the sky to the earth. The black shadow quickly became smaller, and the furious black donkey fell from the sky, breaking through the air and stepping on Sang Sang's head. Sang Sang looked up at the sky, and then she reached out her right hand again. She felt that the vermilion bird's cry was too unpleasant, so she reached out and grabbed its neck to stop the cry. She also felt that the donkey's cry was unpleasant, so she prepared to do what she did before. The black donkey had lived like a prince in the swamp wilderness for many years, so it was naturally a little round. Its neck was very strong and thick. Logically speaking, it should not have been able to be caught with one hand. Moreover, it was coming down from a high altitude and its terrifying front hooves were ready to strike. How could she catch its neck first? To Sang Sang, there were not so many whys and explanations. She could do what she wanted to do. She could pluck a white cloud from the sky, catch a gust of wind, and then she could definitely catch a black donkey. She grabbed the black donkey's neck and lifted it in the air in front of her. No matter how angry the donkey was, it could not make a sound. It could only stare at her, and kept kicking its 4 hooves, looking a little funny. You can't beat her. Forget it. Ning Kai looked at the black donkey and tried to persuade it. He knew why the Gaga was so angry. As the youngest uncle, how could the black donkey have any good impression of Haotian? The black donkey had followed Kuharan around the world and developed a lonely, irascible and arrogant temper. It was not comparable to Ning Kai's shameless big black horse. Naturally, it refused to listen to him and kept kicking its hooves. It thought to itself that it would leave a hoof mark on the face of this little b*tch today, even if it had to risk its life. It did not know what a little b*tch meant, only that it was a dirty word. No matter how arrogant it was, it could only give up in the face of absolute strength. As the king of the swamp, the Gaga was still helpless in front of Haotian. Although it had inherited the pride of the youngest uncle, it did not forget the basic style of the academy. If it could not win, then it would not fight for the time being. It would wait until it could win. Countless wild horses occupied the surface of the swamp. They had never seen the sun and the blue sky in the swamp, so they all looked up curiously and motionlessly, which was particularly interesting. Only the black donkey knew that the wild horses did not dare to see its pitiful appearance, so it was somewhat satisfied. When Ning Kai fed it the powdery juice in the basket, it was even more satisfied. It thought that it had not realized that there was such a wonderful way to eat the fruit today. It had really wasted its life in the past few years. Ning Kai barely repaired the broken carriage and then walked to the front of the donkey. He took out the ointment from his arms and smeared it on the bald fur. After that, he whispered a few words to the Gaga, who nodded indifferently. Then a happy smile appeared on his face. When he returned to the carriage, he met Sang Sang's eyes. From her clear and bright eyes, he knew that she had seen through his plan. But he did not care, because she would definitely know. Those arrangements were originally for the future, and everything must be based on the premise that he could defeat her. Sitting in the broken carriage, the Gaga led the countless wild horses to the fog on the other side of the swamp. It could not avenge its master, but it had tried its best and should have no regrets. But why did the old black donkey on the carriage make people feel so sad? Looking at the dust left by the wild horses and the touching donkey in the dust, Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Then he asked, what kind of person was youngest uncle? Youngest uncle Kuharan was a legend in the back mountain of the academy and also in the human world. Ning Ke inherited his mantle, but did not know him very well, although he had heard many stories. Why did he pull out his sword to the sky? How did he leave the human world? What was he thinking at that moment? What on earth happened in the wilderness at that time? This was a secret that no one knew, not even the headmaster of the academy. Only the dead youngest uncle and Haotian knew. But now Haotian was beside him, so Ning Ke wanted to know. After a moment of silence, Sang Sang said, he was a madman. Kuharan was called Madman Ku by the world, and even Haotian thought that he was a madman. If one thought about it carefully, he would probably understand that this was the greatest glory and pride of a human being. After leaving the swamp, they entered the west wilderness. Ning Ke and Sang Sang went all the way to the west. They did not hurry, so when the black carriage reached the depths of the west wilderness, it was already autumn. Autumn in the wilderness was not as clear as that in the central plains. It had a kind of bleak beauty, but it was cold and chilling. Soon after the morning wind stopped, it began to snow. There were some undulating hills in the wilderness. Beside one of the hills, there was a withered tree that had died a long time ago. The branches wrapped in snow and frost looked like jade carvings carved by skilled craftsmen. They trembled in the wind and snow, as if they were nodding slowly to express their gratitude to their old friends who came to visit. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got out of the carriage and came to the dead tree. The branches suddenly trembled more violently, and the snow and frost on them fell off. Then, the ground in front of the tree, which had been frozen solid by the low temperature, cracked, revealing a hole. He lowered his head to pick up the things in the hole, and then walked back to the carriage. Sang Sang also walked back. The cracked ground in front of the withered tree suddenly closed, and the snow and frost covered the branches again. Everything returned to its original state. Today's 3 chapters count as Monday's consolation. Everyone knows that I haven't asked for votes for dozens of days, and I also said that I don't want votes. But today, I was taught a lesson by the deputy editor. I forgot the relationship between recommendation votes and the number of essence votes, and I'm really sorry that it affected their hard work. Please give me more recommendation votes. Jiang Yi really needs it now. Thank you. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to give me recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 940. The black horse carriage continued to the west. In the carriage, Ning Ke carefully straightened the black cloth and then looked at the chessboard and asked, "Why did you come here?" Sang Sang said, "I want to confirm something." The chessboard was made of some unknown material. It looked like iron and was cold and hard. But when Ning Ke knocked on it with his fingers, it made no sound. The chessboard that Buddha left to the human world was naturally extraordinary. Ning Ke looked at the chessboard and asked after a moment of silence, "What is it? Does it have something to do with Buddha?" Sang Sang said, "Yes, I want to know whether he is dead or alive." Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He had thought that Sang Sang wanted to find a way to return to the divine kingdom through the esoteric Buddhism in Xiankong Temple and even guessed that she might want to destroy Xiankong Temple. But he never thought that she wanted to confirm whether Buddha was dead or alive. Did it mean that Buddha was still alive? I don't understand. Didn't Buddha attain nirvana a long time ago? When we were in Lank Temple, I told you that he was dead, but still alive. Ning Ke remembered that day on the top of Tile Mountain, when she looked at the stone statue of Buddha that was no longer there in the spring rain. She suddenly felt something and said that Buddha was the cat with the surname Shui. At that time, he felt very strange and did not think deeply about it. But he did not expect that she really thought that Buddha might still be alive and came to the West Wilderness for this reason. Ning Ke was very confused. Buddha had attained nirvana. How could he still be alive? What is nirvana? Sang Sang asked. Ning Ke was slightly startled and said, Nirvana is the highest state of Buddhism. Sang Sang said expressionlessly, if nirvana means death, why not just call it death? The question was very simple and even unreasonable. But Ning Ke could not answer it, because he was very clear that her question had actually explained the problem. Sang Sang looked out of the window at the snowy wilderness and said, just like your teacher, Buddha also thought about how to defeat me. He wanted to use his wisdom to understand me, but he could not do it. So he wanted to see through cause and effect and then jump out of it. If he could survive time, he could survive me. But who can really jump out of cause and effect and surpass time? Ning Ke said, so? Sang Sang said, the Buddha hid himself so that I couldn't find him. When the time comes, he will wake up. The so-called fated chance was hard to describe. Perhaps it was when she returned to the divine kingdom, or when she found it difficult to leave the human world and became weaker day by day. A mighty person like the Gautama Buddha must have his own plan. Ning Ke understood a little, but he was more confused. Haotian was omnipotent and omniscient. How could he not know the life and death of the Buddha? Even the headmaster of the academy could not completely avoid Haotian's eyes. It was just that he had merged with the human world, so Haotian could not identify his original body. I am indeed omniscient. Sang Sang said, that's why I don't understand. That's why I want to see. If the Buddha is still alive, I'll kill him. Then I'll know whether he's dead or alive. I don't know if Buddha is dead or alive, so I'll find you. If you're dead, then it's fine. If you're still alive, then I'll kill you. Then, your life and death will be determined. What a domineering declaration. Only she had the right to say such things. Ning Ke suddenly felt that he could only be a family man in front of such a wife. So he consciously picked up the black cloth and began to sew the big black umbrella. Just like that autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang came to the western wilderness from the Lank Temple. But they came through the Buddha's chessboard. Now the Buddha's chessboard was in their hands. In the desolate wilderness, there was a lonely tree. Its trunk was gray, and its leaves were like futons, green in the light snow. It was the Bodhi tree. There were several traces of depression under the Bodhi tree. The inside was as smooth as a mirror, very clean. There were no leaves, dust, or snowflakes. There was nothing inside. The Buddha was lying on his side under the Bodhi tree, closing his eyes to attain nirvana. These were the last traces he left in the human world. The black horse carriage stopped in front of the Bodhi tree. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got off. There was an old monk under the Bodhi tree. The old monk wore a bamboo hat and held a monk's staff. His body seemed to be tightly connected with the desolate and boundless earth. He was as heavy as a mountain, but actually as smooth as a plain. Even the strong wind could not shake him. The old monk was not the Buddha, but the current Buddha in the human world, the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong temple. It had been several autumns since they parted in Chaoyang City. The chief monk was one of the most powerful people Ning Ke had ever seen in his life. Below the headmaster of academy were the abbey dean and him. At this moment, seeing the chief monk sitting under the Bodhi tree, Ning Ke could not help but feel nervous. The chief preaching monk did not look at Ning Ke, but at Sang Sang beside him. The emotions in his eyes were very complicated. There was pity, sympathy, and most of all, determination. Sang Sang wanted to go to the Bodhi tree to see the traces left by Buddha's nirvana. The chief monk was sitting under the Bodhi tree. If he didn't give way, how could he see him? Even if eldest brother and second brother joined hands in their heyday, they might not be able to defeat the chief monk of scripture. Ning Ke had never thought that he could cross this mountain range by himself. Yes, the chief preaching monk was an invisible but majestic mountain range on the earth. His feet seemed to be in the wilderness, and the staff in his hand was the giant tree in the mountain range. "Senior, please make way," Ning Ke said. The chief monk looked at him quietly and asked, "Why should I give way?" Ning Ke said, "We want to see the Bodhi tree." The chief monk sighed and said, "The Bodhi is not a tree." Ning Ke said, "We are not monks. We don't need to be witty." The chief monk said, "Even if the Bodhi is a tree, it is the tree of Xiankong Temple." Sang Sang suddenly said, "Is the name of Xiankong Temple carved on the tree?" This sentence was so unreasonable, like a naughty child talking about a toy. The chief monk of scripture did not expect that Haotian would say such a thing, and he could not help but be stunned. The chief monk of scripture of Xiankong Temple was the top figure in the cultivation world. But in Sang Sang's eyes, he was just a mortal. Even if he was connected with the wilderness, he was just a clumsy stone. Sang Sang walked to the Bodhi tree. Ning Ke became nervous. After Lu Bai entered the Peach Mountain with his sword, this was the dialogue between Haotian and the most powerful human being. The chief monk slowly closed his eyes and did not look at her who was walking under the tree. He sat under the tree, which was a mountain range. Its roots were deeply rooted in the earth's crust, and its peak was so high that it reached the sky. Even if Haotian came to the human world, how could he surpass it? Sang Sang walked to the Bodhi tree and walked to the chief monk. Her feet landed on the chief monk's knees. The chief monk's body was not so tall, and he was even a little thin. But she was so tall and plump. She walked to the chief monk, like a white elephant about to climb the delicate rockery in the garden. This scene looked a little weird and incomprehensible. After her feet landed on the chief monk's body, the rockery became a real mountain range. This mountain range was extremely majestic. She did not care about it and continued to climb. Her left foot landed on the chief monk's shoulder. No matter how high the mountain range was, she only needed to take 3 steps to reach the top. The blue embroidered shoes touched the bamboo hat. The earth was shaking, and the clouds were flying in the sky. She stood on the head of the chief monk, looking at the Bodhi tree in front of her and the Xiankong temple in the distance with her hands behind her back. It was like looking at the scenery from the peak. It was a miraculous scene. For Sang Sang, there was no mountain range in the human world that she could not surpass. Even if this mountain range was so majestic, and its peak was almost touching the sky, there was still a little distance between it and the sky. Even if this mountain range was connected to the wilderness, and there was endless thick soil below it, she could still suppress it. She used the power of the sky to suppress the earth. The earth was still shaking, and it became more and more violent. The blue Bodhi tree did not fall, but its futon-like leaves fell all over the ground. The body of the chief monk also began to shake violently. His kasaya was broken into countless butterflies and scattered in all directions. His pale body was glowing with a faint white luster, like a statue. Ning Ke looked at the scene under the tree and was shocked speechless. He remembered that in Chaoyang City, neither the primordial 13 arrows nor the iron cutlass could leave a trace on the body of the chief monk. The chief monk had cultivated his body to the level of Buddha. Both his body and mind were indestructible. At this moment, it seemed that even if the sky was pressing down on him, he could still hold on. Sang Sang stood on the head of the chief monk with her hands behind her back, looking indifferent. She did not care how long the old monk under her feet could hold on. She just wanted to see the tree. The earth continued to shake violently. Countless black cracks appeared on the barren wilderness, and red magma even spilled out in the distance. Sangsang's cyan dress with flowers fluttered in the wind and the thin snow. She slowly fell down. The chief monk of scripture under her feet slowly sank into the earth, squeezing out countless black mud and making a teeth-aching grinding sound and the sound of rocks breaking. It did not take long for the chief monk of scripture to completely sink into the earth, leaving only his head above the ground. 2 wisps of white eyebrows floated in the smoke and dust, looking extremely gloomy. As long as one did not leave the earth, he would be indestructible. This was the supreme dharma cultivated by the chief monk of scripture. Even if the abbey dean regained his state, he would not be able to do anything to him. Sangsang's method was very simple. She directly let him become one with the earth. The chief monk of scripture's head was on the ground with his eyes closed. Sangsang walked down from his head. It was only a short stone step. She did not look back at the most powerful Buddhist sect. She walked to the Bodhi tree with her hands behind her back. She had told the chief monk that the name of Xiankong Temple was not carved on the Bodhi tree, so the tree did not belong to Xiankong Temple. In fact, the Bodhi tree was carved with her name, so it was hers. That autumn, she and Ning Ke escaped from the Lank Temple and came here. At that time, they were chased by the world and were depressed. Ning Ke took her to see the remains of Buddha, and then he carved a line of words under the Bodhi tree. In the autumn of the 16th year of Tianqi era, Ning Ke of the academy came here with his wife Sangsang, the daughter of Yama. After seeing the traces of Buddha's nirvana under the Bodhi tree, she left the Bodhi tree with her hands behind her back and walked to the distant peak that was level with the ground. The Xiankong Temple was in the middle of the peak. Ning Ke looked at the line of words on the Bodhi tree and smiled. He looked at the head of the chief monk of scripture on the ground and sighed. Then he drove the carriage to chase her tall figure in the field. First of all, thank you for your votes. Please continue to teach me and vote. Thank you very much. Next, it's hard to sustain the pace of 10,000 votes a day. It's not our style, isn't it? So that's it for today. I'll sort out the following plot and have a big explosion tomorrow. I'm used to this kind of neurotic pace. Anyway, I don't need the monthly votes. I can do whatever I want as long as the total is not small. Ha ha ha, I'm happy just thinking about it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 941. Coming to the cliff, Ning Ke looked at the giant peak of the giant sinkhole and the temple between the peaks in silence. This was the second time he had seen the true face of Xiankong Temple, but he was still shocked. The cliff was very steep, and it suddenly sank from the surface of the wilderness, which was quite shocking. Ning Ke left the big black horse and the carriage on the ground and followed Sangsang down. He and Sangsang had been here before, but they turned away after a glance from a distance, not daring to go down. The situation now was naturally different from before. Sangsang looked calm and walked slowly with her hands behind her back, like a snow lotus falling in the wind. But Ning Ke, who was behind her, looked a little embarrassed. It was noon, and the early autumn sunshine was bright enough to clearly illuminate the smooth cliff and the narrow path made of gravel. But the cliff was thousands of feet deep, and the further they went, the darker the light became, and the temperature gradually dropped. It was very cold, and there was even snow between the cliff stones, which was quite amazing. They continued to walk in the cold world of ice and snow. After a long time, they finally walked out of the shadow cast by the wilderness into the giant sinkhole, and came to the bright sunshine. There was a boundless field under the sunshine. The field at the bottom of the sinkhole was very wide. Even with Ning Kei's sharp eyesight, he could not clearly see the scene in the distance. There were all kinds of yurts scattered in the field. On the ground near the cliff, there were cold-resistant meadows. Cows and sheep with long fluffy hair were eating in the meadows. Contrary to the process of walking down the cliff, the two of them walked toward the center of the giant sinkhole field. The temperature was getting higher and higher, as if it was going to warm spring from winter. The natural grass in the field was gradually replaced by artificially cultivated species, and the ears in the field kept swaying in the breeze to greet them. Ning Kei walked to the field and picked an ear. He rubbed the shell with his fingers and found that the grain inside was much smaller than the rice commonly seen in the Central Plains, and the grain fragrance was a little strange. He pulled one out and found that the root system of this plant was quite developed. He guessed that this was probably a special kind of rice, which could resist the cold by absorbing the warmth from the ground. Judging from the shape of the leaves, it probably had a relatively low demand for light. This underground wilderness was far away from the human world, so the sunlight was not as abundant as it was on the surface. Fortunately, Haotian was always fair. The temperature of the soil in the wilderness was a little high, and the rivers flowing through it were different from the cold rivers in Ning Kei's imagination. They were covered with a light mist like a hot spring. This underground field was a completely new world for Ning Quebec. Of course, because of his poor background and the influence of the academy, what he cared most about was food. At this moment, a faint bell suddenly rang in the distance, and then a pious buzzing sound came from all directions in the field, attracting his attention. He looked into the distance and vaguely saw countless people kneeling on the ground. He knew that they should be the farmers who worshipped the Xiankong temple. They started chanting after hearing the bell. The sound of the bell came from an even further distance, coming from the huge mountain peak in the middle of the vast wilderness. It was unknown which yellow temple or hall in the middle of the peak was the monk who was striking the bell. Sang Sang walked toward the mountain. Ning Kei suddenly thought of something, but he missed it and could not remember it again. He shook his head regretfully and quickened his pace. The mountain was very tall and majestic. He could feel the pressure from miles away, as if it was right in front of him, but in fact, the mountain was still in the sky. Sang Sang did not say anything and walked toward the mountain. Although she and Ning Kei did not deliberately, they still walked very fast. Even so, it still took them a long time to walk to the foot of the mountain. It was already dusk. The world at dusk should be warm, but for the world in the giant sinkhole, there was only darkness and coldness. The setting sun in the west could not reach here at all. The vast field at the bottom of the pit and the entire mountain were shrouded in shadows. Only the highest peak was still in the twilight, like a candle flame. Looking at the mountain road in the night, Ning Kei quietly adjusted his breath and was ready for battle. Although Sang Sang was unimaginably powerful, and even the chief monk of scripture was just a stone under her feet, the Xiankong temple on this mountain was, after all, the unknown place of Buddhism. It had been passed down for countless years and had a deep foundation. Who knew what kind of dangers were hidden in it? Sang Sang suddenly stopped and turned to look at the road they came from. Ning Kei felt a little strange. He followed her gaze and saw that the cliff they came down from at noon had become a scenery far away, and the snow between the cliffs had long been gone. The cliffs around the giant sinkhole were very far from the bottom of the mountain. According to common thinking, the cliff should have become an inconspicuous black line, but it was still towering at this time. The long cliff was too high. The mountain where the Xiankong temple was located was higher than any mountain on the surface of the earth, but the peak was only level with the surface of the wilderness. This meant that the cliff surrounding the giant sinkhole was as high as the mountain, and higher than any other mountain in the world. Ning Kei and Sang Sang stood here and looked around. They felt that the giant sinkhole was a huge dry well, and the high cliff was the wall of the well. The people standing at the bottom of the well were blocked by the wall of the well. The people living here had seen the round sky for generations, while the fields in the field were square and incomparably orderly. Was this the so-called round sky and square earth? Ning Ke looked at the scene in front of him and thought with some shock. Sang Sang couldn't help but feel shocked. She only made such a comment about this magical world created by Buddha. A frog in a well. The two did not continue to stay. They walked directly to the peak under the cover of the night. The mountain road hidden in the forest and flowers was not as steep as before, but it was long as if there was no end. The big black horse and the horse carriage were left on the ground. Ning Ke naturally carried all the things that could not be separated from him. At the moment when Sang Sang boldly decided to come to the Xiankong temple to confirm the life and death of Buddha, he had made clear his identity. He was a handyman, porter, cook, feet-washing technician, and bed warmer. He had no objection to this. It was a couple's life, and someone had to take care of the outside and the inside. Since his wife had the ability to take care of the outside, why not he take care of the inside? The heavy arrow case and iron cutlass, the big black umbrella, and the Buddha's chessboard were carefully packed into the luggage, which was now on his back. The luggage was too heavy, and the mountain road between the peaks was so long. Even though he had cultivated the great spirit and was extremely strong, he still felt a little tired. The mountain was too big, and there were too many yellow temples hidden in the forest. It was said that Yueluan Kingdom was a prosperous place for Buddhism, and there were 72 temples in Misty Rain. In an hour, he and Sang Sang had already seen more than this number of temples. Since Sang Sang was here to find someone, she naturally had to go to every temple. This meant that they had to walk a longer distance, which also meant that Ning Ke had to walk a longer distance with the heavy luggage, and he was climbing a slope. When they passed by each temple, Sang Sang did not look carefully, so it was hard to tell what method she was using. When they walked to the edge of a cliff, Ning Ke finally sat down on a stone. "Let's rest for a while." He wiped his sweat and said while panting, "I don't think it's a good idea to search blindly." Sang Sang was naturally not tired, but she felt a little tired and sleepy like she had been since they left Peach Mountain. She walked with her eyes closed most of the time, as if she was really sleeping. Of course, she did look like a blind person walking. Listening to Ning Ke's words, she said indifferently, "Do you want me to die so badly?" Ning Ke understood why she was so anxious to confirm whether Buddha was dead or alive. If Buddha was still alive, he would be the only existence in the world that could threaten her. She had to kill Buddha while she was still strong enough. Otherwise, she would be in great danger when she returned to the divine kingdom or became immortal. In this case, her words made sense. But he felt bored and said while covering his forehead, "Can you put it in another way? You have said it so many times, aren't you tired of it? Can you not seek death at the slightest provocation? Although we are husband and wife, you can't really treat yourself as an ordinary woman." Sang Sang ignored him and said, "If I want to find someone, I will." "Where is the person you are looking for?" Ning Ke came to Xiankong Temple mainly to accompany her, but also to find someone. Outside the academy, Seventh Sister had specifically told him to come here and see if that proud man was still as proud as he was now kneeling in front of the Buddha. Along the way from the foot of the mountain, Sang Sang had searched hundreds of yellow temples in the lower half of the mountain. But he just followed her and did not look like he was looking for someone. He said, "Senior brother will definitely not cultivate Buddhism here. Why waste your energy?" Sang Sang asked, "Why?" Ning Ke said with certainty, "Senior brother is such a genius. Who in Xiankong Temple is qualified to teach him? He must be reading Buddhist scriptures in the temple on the peak. Why would he linger in these shabby temples at the foot of the mountain?" Sang Sang thought for a while and looked at him. She said, "Idiot." Ning Ke thought that his inference was so reasonable, but she did not think of it. How could she call him an idiot? Kuharan could not bear it, and neither could Aunt Xiao. How am I an idiot? He asked angrily. Sang Sang ignored him and continued to walk up the mountain with her hands behind her. Ning Kai carried his heavy luggage and ran behind her. He kept asking himself how he was an idiot. She knew that her man liked to call others idiots. How could she call him an idiot for no reason? They searched all the way, but the temple was deserted at night. They searched all the hundreds of yellow temples in the dozens of cliffs at the foot of the mountain, but still found nothing. Finally, they came to the top of the mountain, and the night had passed. The new morning sun was still lying on the surface of the wilderness. The morning light first illuminated the cliff in the west, and then the peak. It was like a candle wick that had been extinguished for a whole night was reignited. Then the light spread from the peak to the foot of the mountain at a speed visible to the naked eye. The bell rang and the Buddhist chants were heard. The Buddhist land was thus awakened. Chapter 1. P.S. I don't have time to revise it recently. If there are any rough parts, just blink and pretend you didn't see it. Sorry, keep writing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 942. When the Buddha land woke up, countless monks in the yellow temples also woke up. But as the saying goes, as long as Sang Sang is in my hand, I am in the human world. Ning Kai was not worried about being found by the Xiankong temple, so he continued to look around like last night. He would go into every yellow temple and carefully observe if there was any trace of his senior brother. It was a time-consuming thing, so it was Sang Sang's turn to feel troubled. On a cliff platform covered by ivy, she turned to Ning Kai and asked, "Are you looking for Jun Mo?" Ning Kai said, "Of course, I can't help you find Buddha." Sang Sang said, "Idiot." After saying this, she continued to walk forward on the cliff platform. Ning Kai was stunned. He was not as angry as last night, but confused. Why did she say he was an idiot? As the indigo dress moved forward, the ivy separated and Sang Sang walked by. Ning Kai quickened his pace to catch up with her before the ivy swung back. Then he found that the cliff platform was a little strange. There was an unknown tree on the edge of the cliff with a green canopy, which was very quiet. There was a very small temple behind the pine tree. The yellow paint had long peeled off and the stone steps were covered with dust. It seemed that no one had been here for many years. Along the way from the foot of the peak, all the temples were either magnificent or sacred. Ning Kai and Sang Sang had never seen such a dilapidated temple, which was very strange. What made Ning Kai even more strange was that he felt a faint familiar aura from the dilapidated temple. He and Sang Sang had practiced Buddhism in the Lank Temple, so they could sense the supreme Buddha nature in the aura. The trace of Buddha nature was very pure and compassionate, and very powerful, even more powerful than the Buddha nature they felt in the temples last night. How could a temple with such pure Buddha nature be so dilapidated? How could the monks in the Xiankong temple forget this temple? Who used to live in this shabby temple? Was this the place Sang Sang was looking for? Could it be that the Buddha was hiding here? Standing under the tree on the edge of the cliff, Ning Kai looked at the dilapidated temple and suddenly felt a little cold. He subconsciously leaned to Sang Sang and asked, "Is it here?" Sang Sang looked a little serious, but she did not say anything and walked directly into the temple. The temple door was pushed open with a squeak. When the cobwebs were about to fall, a breeze blew and swept to the endless abyss under the cliff. After entering, Ning Kai found that it was a fake temple. Standing on the cliff platform, he could only see the front of the temple. There was not even a Zen temple inside, but only a dusty corridor. The corridor led straight to the cliff, and there was a deep cave on the wall. Ning Ke became more and more nervous, but Sang Sang remained calm. She walked directly into the cave and looked around with her hands clasped behind her back, showing a touch of annoyance on her face. The cave was quiet and dry. The furnishings inside were extremely simple, even simpler than the cliff cave where Ning Ke had secluded himself in the back mountain of the academy. There was only a futon. The futon was lying in front of the deepest cave wall, covered with dust. The futon was covered with dust. The futon was in a. There was a shadow on the stone wall opposite the futon. Looking closely, one could find that the shadow was a human figure, and the cloud edge of the kasaya could be vaguely seen on the edge. A long time ago, there was a monk who meditated here and faced the wall. He sat there for countless years and even left his figure on the stone wall. Which eminent monk was he? Ning Ke was very shocked. Sang Sang did not care who the eminent monk was. She took a look and knew that the person was not the Buddha she was looking for, so she was a little annoyed. "You are too slow. Don't follow me." After saying this, she walked out of the cave. Ning Ke looked at her back and said, "I also want to find someone." Sang Sang did not look back and said, "Idiot." Ning Ke did not want to be angry and said, "Even if I am an idiot, I still want to find someone. What if we get lost?" Sang Sang said, "I can find you." After Sang Sang left, there was only Ning Ke in the cave. He looked at the shadow on the stone wall and shook his head. He was ready to leave, but he slowly stopped at the entrance of the cave. Previously, under the tree on the cliff plateau, he felt that the aura from the ruined temple was very familiar. Now in the cave, this feeling became more and more obvious. He even felt that he had seen the shadow on the stone wall somewhere. Ning Ke thought for a while and turned back to the depth of the cave. He looked at the shadow on the stone wall and thought for a long time. Then he felt a little tired and sat on the ground. He forgot that the futon in front of the stone wall was so old that it could not stand people sitting on it. As soon as his body touched the futon, it scattered into countless cattail grass and floated everywhere. What the hell is this? Ning Ke looked at the cattail grass on the ground and shook his head helplessly. He reached out and gathered all the loose grass together. Then he took out a needle and thread from his luggage and began to sew skillfully. It did not take long for him to mend the futon. He tried to make sure that the futon would not be damaged again. Then he stuffed it under his buttocks and continued to look at the shadow on the stone wall. The shadow on the stone wall was imprinted by the Buddha nature of the previous generation of eminent monks. It was indeed a very magical dharma. If it was in the temples of the human world, it would definitely be worshipped by countless believers of the Buddhism sect. But what did it have to do with him? Ning Ke did not know why the shadow on the stone wall was so attractive to him. His eyes fell on it and he did not want to look away. He always felt that there were countless mysteries waiting for him to discover. He was tired of standing, so he sat down. After sitting and watching for a long time, he was also a little tired, so he hugged his knees and rested his head on them. After a while, he changed his posture again. He rested his chin on his hand and looked at the stone wall quietly. He was like a child in the countryside watching a social play, watching it with relish. During the process of looking at the wall, Ning Ke did not sit cross-legged, did not sit on the lotus seat, did not make the emblematic gesture, and did not meditate. He looked very casual and seemed to be in a daze. But in fact, he sat on the lotus in his sense of perception and made the emblematic gesture. The Dharma that he had seen in the Lank Temple and learned from Master Qishan kept floating in his mind, but he did not meditate. After a long time, Sang Sang returned to the dark cave. She had gone to the 3 halls of the Xiankong Temple for a long time, but still did not find that person. Seeing Ning Ke in a daze, her eyes slightly brightened, but she did not say anything. She turned around and walked out of the cave again. This time, she went to the commandment yard on the west peak. There were countless towering ancient trees in the west peak, but there was still no trace of Buddha. Her expression became more and more serious. She stood on the twisted roots of the ancient trees that protruded out of the cliff, looking at the sun in the sky silently. If heaven's calculation could not be calculated, then there was no mystery of heaven. Then where should the heart of heaven fall? Sang Sang returned to the remote cliff platform again, walked into the dilapidated temple, and came behind Ning Quebec. Ning Ke was still in a daze while looking at the shadow on the stone wall. Sang Sang left again. This time, she went to the east peak full of rugged rocks, but still found nothing. She stood among the rocks and looked at the sun in the sky silently. She returned to the old temple cave again. Ning Ke was still facing the wall. She left again. And came back again. She had done this countless times. Although she was Haotian, she felt a little tired and puzzled. Heaven's calculation could not be calculated and the mystery of heaven could not be seen. Why did the heart of heaven always fall on this guy's side? Could it be that she could not leave him? Thinking of this possibility, Sang Sang looked at Ning Ke's back with infinite hatred and irritation in her eyes. She wanted to kill him and then suppress him to the deepest part of the earth. But she could not kill him after all. She still wanted to be herself. So she could only wave her sleeves and leave the cave again to continue her search. Ning Ke did not know that Sang Sang had once wanted to kill him, and he almost died. He was still looking at the shadow on the stone wall with his chin in his hand. His expression kept changing, sometimes solemn and sometimes silly. A day passed like this. When the sun set, a white flower bloomed on the unknown green tree by the cliff. It only bloomed for a moment, then left the branch and fell to the ground. The white flower fell on the cliff and touched the dust. It was blown up by the breeze outside the cliff, as if it was slowly lifted by a pair of invisible hands. It floated into the dilapidated temple door, drifted to the stone wall in the cave, and gently fell on Ning Ke's shoulder. Ning Ke reached out to pick the small white flower off his shoulder. He gently pinched the delicate flower handle with his fingers, looked at the shadow on the stone wall, and said with a smile, "So you used to learn Buddhism here." With this sentence, the pieces of consciousness in the deepest part of his sense of perception, which had been sleeping for many years, suddenly lit up and then gradually faded, like the most dazzling brilliance of an old pearl. At dusk, the bell of Xiankong Temple rang again, echoing in every corner of the peak. Ning Ke woke up and bowed to the shadow on the stone wall. Then he got up and walked out of the cave to the green tree by the cliff. He calmly looked at the scenery of the Buddha land in front of him. This old temple was the old residence of Lotus. When Lotus studied Buddhism in Xiankong Temple, he sat on the wall for several years in the cave, leaving his shadow and the legend of the front gate of Buddhism in the human world. In the front gate of Devil's doctrine, he inherited the mantle of youngest uncle and everything of Lotus. Before Lotus died, he once said to him, "You have joined the devil. If you want to cultivate the devil's doctrine, you must first cultivate Buddhism. Then please walk bravely into the darkness. Although you have little chance of success and may die as soon as you start on the road, I still wish you well and curse you." Ning Ke had long forgotten this. Although he had cultivated Buddhism with Master Qishan in Lang Temple, it was to cure Sang Sang. He had never actively studied Buddhism. It was not until today when he came to Xiankong Temple and meditated for a whole day in front of the shadow on the stone wall that he remembered the words and Lotus's instructions and really made up for this very important lesson. After facing the wall for a day, Ning Ke had gained a lot. Although there was no change on the surface and his cultivation state was still in the knowing destiny state, he had planted a Bodhi seed in his heart. Perhaps the Bodhi seed would germinate and break out of the soil at any time. Eventually, it would grow green and cover the eyes of heaven and Buddha. In the twilight, Sangsang returned to the edge of the cliff. Ning Ke said, "It seems that you still haven't found Buddha." Sangsang said, "You haven't found him either." Ning Ke said, "I forgot to find senior brother." Sangsang asked, "What are you doing?" Ning Ke said, "I'm looking at it." Sangsang said indifferently, "What's there to look at in the Buddhist psyche left by an old monk?" Ning Ke walked to her and put the small white flower in her hair. He said happily, "It's really beautiful. The second chapter is really well written. If Ning Ke becomes a heart thief, he really has the potential. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 943. At times like this, smart girls usually wouldn't speak. They would just lower their heads shyly. Smarter girls would probably take the opportunity to snuggle into a man's arms. Only overly smart girls would ask that question, "Do you mean the flowers are prettier, or am I prettier?" Sangsang would not ask such a question. She did not show any shyness on her face, nor would she snuggle into Ning Ke's arms. She acted as if she had heard nothing and went straight to the other side of the cliff yard. Ning Ke was a little disappointed. But he felt very satisfied and happy when he saw the small white flower on her temple gently trembling in the evening wind and noticed that she did not want to take it off. "Have you seen my second brother?" He pushed away the dense green vines and chased after Sangsang to ask. In his opinion, second brother should be meditating on the Dharma on the peak or somewhere in the commandment yard. Sangsang should have seen him when she was looking for Buddha. Sangsang did not turn around. She kept walking with her hands behind her back and said, "Idiot." Ning Ke could not remember how many times she had called him an idiot. His anger had long turned into numbness. He shook his head helplessly and realized that he was really an idiot when he saw the scene below the peak. As dusk fell, the giant sinkhole surrounded by the cliff became extremely dark. Only the field near the peak could be vaguely seen because of the reflection of the yellow temple roof. There were countless black spots moving slowly in the field below the peak, looking like diligent ants. Ning Ke knew that they were the farmers that he and Sangsang had seen before. That year at the edge of the giant sinkhole, Ning Ke estimated that there were more than 1,000 monks in Xiankong Temple and at least 100,000 people living in the field to maintain this Buddhist country. Now that he came to the Xiankong Temple, he found that there were countless temples on this mountain, and the number of monks they supported was far beyond his imagination. There were at least tens of thousands of monks, which meant that there were millions of farmers who had been living in the dark underground world for generations. In order to maintain the existence of Xiankong Temple, the monks had to drive these farmers like livestock. In this sense, those farmers were more like serfs that had long been abolished in the Central Plains. The more difficult the place was, the stricter the social class was. Ning Ke looked at the black spots moving slowly at the foot of the mountain and understood that those serfs must be carrying out daily offerings to the monks. His expression gradually became solemn, as if he had seen those tragic scenes that he had not really seen. At that time, he and Sangsang only took a glance at Xiankong Temple and left quietly. At that time, he thought that if he was a man of great wisdom and courage, he might climb down the cliff and secretly go to the miserable world under the clouds to launch a rebellion among the serfs and overthrow the deformed Xiankong Temple. But he was not. Someone was wise and brave. That person was naturally second senior brother Jun Mo. Jun Mo left Chang'an and traveled thousands of miles to Xiankong Temple to cultivate Buddhism. However, with his temperament, how could he cultivate Buddhism after seeing the real situation of Xiankong Temple? Practicing Buddhism was not worshipping Buddha. Junemo saw that the world was so miserable. Not to mention kowtowing in front of Buddha, he would definitely draw his sword in anger and kill the monks and Buddha in the temple first. Ning Ke searched for Junemo in the Xiankong temple. No wonder Sang Sang called him an idiot. Senior brother must be down there. He looked at the gradually darkening miserable world at the foot of the mountain and said, I'm going there to see him. Do you want to go with me? Sang Sang came to Xiankong temple to find Buddha. He thought that she would not be willing to spend time with him to find second senior brother, but he did not expect that she would agree. Climbing the peak last night and descending the mountain tonight, the yellow temples and palaces along the way were naturally different because of their different moods. In Ning Ke's eyes, there was no difference between them and the white bone mountain in the front gate of Devil's Doctrine. When he climbed the mountain last night, he saw the magnificent and solemn temples and thought that it was natural for Xiankong Temple to be the holy land of Buddhism. But now he knew that it was not the case. Xiankong Temple was isolated from the world, but it could be so magnificent. It must have absorbed the marrow of the serfs at the foot of the mountain. The more magnificent the temple was, the more miserable the world under the mountain was. Walking down the giant peak and away from the ancient temple of Buddha land, they came to the real miserable world. The green and joyful field in his eyes yesterday now looked so gloomy in the night. The night could not completely blind Ning Ke's eyes. He and Sang Sang moved forward in silence, and his eyes slowly swept across the field. He saw fields with different kinds of rice, underground rivers with hot steam, and even a few mountains. But these mountains were too inconspicuous compared to the giant peak, just like mounds of earth. At the bend of the river, he saw the place where people panned for gold. He also saw many arms cut off by sharp weapons. Behind the hill, he saw gems and emeralds in the grass. He also saw the corpses that were eaten by vultures. Occasionally, he could hear the strange cries of birds. The field was not completely dark, and he could see many bonfires emitting light. Tents and yurts were scattered on the ground. Nobles who were as fat as pigs wore all kinds of gem necklaces, held wine utensils made of skulls, and stepped on girls' naked breasts with their muddy feet. No matter which tribe it was, there were always a lot of valiant men standing next to the nobles. Those men held whips and sharp knives in their hands. Sometimes the whips fell on the cows and sheep, but more often on the female slaves. The sharp knives were sometimes used to cut the mutton, but more often they were stabbed into the chests of the men or the fathers of the female slaves. Blood and wine mixed together. The nobles seemed so happy, while the cowardly and numb serfs could only keep kneeling in front of the temples on the mountain peaks, like useless ants. It was understandable that they were cowardly and numb. However, when those serfs used their hands to offer the most precious gold and silver and the most chaste daughters to the monks, they looked so happy. There were not many monks in the field, but they had a status that even the nobles could not imagine. They sat in the warm yurts, and their palms gently fell on the heads of their believers or on the girls who knelt beside them. The scene was a little weird. It was a mixture of holiness and obscenity, very mysterious but still dirty. Ning Ke looked at the tent in the distance and listened to the chanting and moaning coming from there. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "It's really ugly." The small white flower in Sang Sang's hair gently trembled in the night wind. He looked at her and asked, "Why?" Ning Ke had a very deep understanding of the ugly and tragic side of the human world. He did not know how much he had seen since he was a child. However, he could not understand why such an extremely unstable social structure could last for so many years, and why people living here could endure for so many years and even seemed very happy. As I said, this is a well. Sang Sang looked at the cliff in the distant night sky and said, "They are like frogs in a well and can't see anything. When they see the monks on the mountain, they think they are real Buddhas. And Buddhas are the most deceptive." Ning Ke thought for a moment and said, "Second brother is right. all monks should die. Sang Sang said, the academy has always only looked at heaven, not the human world. She did not show any sarcasm on her face, but Ning Ke knew what she wanted to say. However, even someone as unreasonable as him could not defend himself after seeing this miserable world. You are right, he said, but since second brother is here, the academy will definitely take care of it. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked a little slowly because they wanted to see. They did not walk until the next morning. The morning light illuminated the Xiankong temple between the peaks, but they were still a long distance away from the cliff. The closer they were to the cliff and the farther they were from the peak where the Xiankong temple was located, the lower the temperature was, the poorer the crops were, and the more enslaved the serfs were and the more miserable their lives were. The agricultural products in the field gradually became scarce, and the cold-resistant weeds gradually became lush. Cows and sheep with their long gray hair walked slowly in the meadow. There were piles of stones in the grass, and tattered banners were hanging on them. Ning Ke had seen some piles of stones and banners the day before yesterday, but he did not pay much attention to them. Now when he walked closer, he found the scattered black blood and a faint smell of blood on the stones. As they moved forward, he and Sang Sang saw more disabled serfs who had been tortured. Some had their tongues cut off, some had their ears cut off, and some had their calf bones smashed. They were in all kinds of miserable states. They looked so miserable and ugly that he couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Ning Ke knew that his senior brother must be in the most miserable place, so he knew that he was on the right path. Sang Sang could not find the Buddha, but it was not difficult to find someone. So he took him to the depths of the meadow. Cattle and sheep were scattered on the meadow, as beautiful as clouds, but the color was a little out of place. Not far from the sheep, there must be a shabby yurt. Behind the yurt, there was often a lake. The lake water was blue, salty, or sweet. A large area of wetland was formed naturally by the lake water, and the aquatic plants were extremely abundant. A little girl in a dirty old leather coat was waving a small whip to drive her 4 lambs. Ning Ke and Sang Sang looked at the little girl and subconsciously thought of Tang Xiaotang. It was probably the first time for the little girl to see strangers, but she was not afraid at all. She smiled and waved to them. The smile on her dark face was so clean, and her teeth were so white that it made people dizzy. Ning Ke looked at her and smiled. The little girl drove the 4 lambs to them. Without saying anything, she took Ning Ke's hand and led him and Sang Sang to the yurt, meaning that they would be guests. This field was deep underground, isolated from the world, and outsiders could not find it. But it was still the human world. Ning Ke thought of the cruel scenes he had seen that night, and then looked at the little girl holding his hand. Suddenly, he thought of the ruined city of Wei and the young men and women dancing around the bonfire outside the city of Wei. Hell and heaven were both in the human world. Sang Sang said, "Ignorance is naivety, and naivety is cruelty. Can't you see through it?" Ning Ke said, "Even so, there is no need to say it." At this moment, he saw the scene on the other side of the lake. There was a crowd of people kneeling on the ground, surrounding a monk. The monk was wearing a dirty khaki robe, and the sleeve of his right arm kept swinging in the wind. If it was someone else, it would be very ugly. But with his solemn and elegant demeanor, it looked so proper, and no one could find any fault with it. Chapter 3, and, before 12 o'clock, come out, Chapter 4. Hell and heaven are both in the human world. This is the lyric of Do Wei's song, which was used when Lotus was born. A few days ago, a reader at me on Weibo. I saw it, but I didn't reply. Then, I suddenly realized that it was a good use here. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 944. In the field under the Xiankong temple, the monks were all punished by the commandment hall, so they naturally had no patience for their followers. Their cruelty was even more terrible than that of the nobles in the tribes. The monk by the lake was able to make his followers kneel so close to him, and he did not frown because of the bad smell on them. He looked extremely calm and natural. The monk was so extraordinary that he was Junemo separated by the lake. The wind was a little strong. Ning Ke listened casually and did not hear what second brother was saying. He took the little girl's hand and walked over there, gradually quickening his pace. At this moment, the sound of galloping horses could be heard from the side of the meadow. A dozen or so strong men galloped over on fine horses, led by a man dressed in fur. He waved the whip in his hand as he looked at the nomads kneeling on the ground and scolded them sternly, probably telling them to disperse. The herdsmen got up in fear and wanted to disperse, but they were worried that the guru they had painstakingly invited would be hurt by the whip. They hurriedly waved their hands and explained to the man on the horse. "Lord Bai, this is..." Before he could finish speaking, the whip lashed down fiercely and landed on an old herdsman's shoulder, leaving a bloody gash. This was only because the man was not sitting properly. Otherwise, if the whip had landed, the old herdsman's shoulder would have been torn off. How vicious was this man? The men who followed the nobles all drew out their swords from their saddles and shouted at the herdsman by the lake. They did not advance and brandish their swords to threaten the herdsman by the lake. Some even urged their horses to drive them away. The nobles looked at Junemo, who was surrounded by the herdsmen, and shouted, "The living Buddha said that he is an evil man from the foreign sect, not a guru at all. Get out of the way." The herdsmen looked at the nobles in horror, but they did not get out of the way. They were not brave enough to disobey Lord Bai's order, but they firmly believed that Junemo was the guru. Otherwise, how could he be so merciful to them? Therefore, they were very afraid that Lord Bai would be punished by Buddha if he hurt the guru. The nobles also knew that it was impossible to explain to these stupid untouchables. He raised the whip in his hand and pointed at Junemo, saying, "Tie this cripple up." The living Buddha said that he would be burned to death. The men answered in unison and urged their horses to rush to the lake. The swords in their hands reflected the sunlight and looked extremely sharp. The herdsmen were frightened and fled in all directions. Seeing that the monk in yellow was about to be knocked down, the nobles' eyes became cruel. The living Buddha had indeed said to capture this evil person alive and then burn him to death. However, this evil person actually dared to incite his own slave to rebel. Before he was burned to death, no matter what, he had to suffer. Should he cut off his ear, or cut off his remaining left arm, or peel off the skin of his face? Just as he was thinking about this, the nobleman suddenly felt a gust of cold wind behind his head. How could he dodge in time? He felt a chill on his ear, and then his left shoulder lightened. Then, he felt something wet on his face. Waves appeared in the blue lake, as if a strange beast was coming ashore. A black shadow broke through the waves, whistling through the air, and finally landed in the hands of the monk in yellow. It was a square and thick iron sword. Junemo waved the sword, and more than 10 heads flew into the air. More than 10 streams of blood sprayed from the necks of the men to the sky, as if to wash away the sinful sky. Although the iron sword was wide and thick, the person who used the sword never knew the meaning of it. He only knew the principle of righteousness. There was no intense scene, not even a battle. Junemo just waved the sword and everything was over. The nobles looked at this scene and his face turned pale. He opened his mouth for a long time, unable to speak. Then he gradually felt the pain. He reached out to touch his face and found that it was covered in blood. The iron sword broke through the lake and landed in Junemo's hand. It happened to pass by the side of the noble's horse. With just a brush, the nobles lost an ear, an arm, and a piece of flesh was cut off from his face. The noble's face was covered in blood, and his ear and arm were cut off. He looked extremely miserable. When he found all this, he was even more painful and frightened, and almost fainted. As a man who had lived in such a harsh environment, he managed to keep himself from falling off the horse. But when he looked at Junemo by the lake, his eyes were filled with fear. The nobles did not expect that this evil man was so powerful. Without hesitation, he pulled the reins with his remaining arm and rode back to his tribe. He did not dare to look back or say anything cruel, so that the evil man would wait for him to come back for revenge. Of course, he would definitely come back for revenge, and then he would kill all the people here. The herdsmen who had fled in all directions gradually came back. Looking at the dozens of corpses by the lake and the horses who were a little confused because they had lost their owners, their eyes were also very confused. Living in the cruel underground world, they had seen many bloody scenes, and even more brutal ones. But they had never imagined that the most powerful butchers of Lord Bai would one day be killed in such a simple way. Looking at the yellow-robed monk by the lake, the herdsmen knelt again. Their faces were full of awe and fear, and there was a faint uneasiness on their faces. They did not know what to do next. The old herdsman walked up to Junemo and knelt down. He kissed the ground in front of Junemo's shoes and said in a trembling voice, "Great and merciful Guru, please leave quickly." Junemo looked at the top of his head expressionlessly and said, "Because I will implicate you if I stay?" "No." The old herdsman raised his head. His dark face was full of wrinkles, and the wrinkles were full of painful tears. He said, "If you have time, you will definitely become the most powerful guru or even the living Buddha. But although you are powerful now, you are still not enough. As for us, we will definitely die. Please don't worry." Junemo's expression gradually became gentle. He said, "That man will come with countless swords and arrows, and even the living Buddha you mentioned. So I have to stay here." The old herdsman said in a trembling voice, "Even if you can kill all the warriors of Lord Bai, or even defeat the living Buddha, you will anger the Buddha on the holy mountain, the Buddha?" Junemo looked at the extremely high mountain in the distance and said expressionlessly, "In your eyes, the holy mountain is very high. But if you have a chance to walk on the ground, you will know that the mountain is actually very short. From the ground, it is just an inconspicuous little mound." Hearing this, the lakeside suddenly became very quiet. Only the sound of the fish swimming in the lake, frightened by the iron sword, could be heard. The herdsmen looked very confused. They had never heard such words. They did not know what the ground was. Was the field they were standing on not the ground? Was there another ground? Where was that ground? Why did the holy mountain look like a little mound when standing on that ground? No, how could the holy mountain be a little mound? A clear and childish voice broke the silence. Ning Kei held the little girl's hand and asked curiously, "Master, where is the ground you mentioned?" The herdsmen by the lakeside looked very frightened. In their opinion, the little girl's question should not be asked, because it meant blasphemy to the holy mountain and the Buddha. A middle-aged woman, who was probably the little girl's mother, was so scared that her face turned pale. She wanted to drag her back and beat her, but she found that her daughter was holding a stranger's hand, so she did not dare to do so. Junemo saw Ning Kei and Sang Sang. He was slightly stunned, and then ignored them. He said to the little girl, "We are now underground, and the ground is above." He pointed behind him and said, "Climb up this cliff, and you will arrive at the real ground." Behind him was the extremely high and steep cliff. For countless years, it was this cliff that imprisoned countless generations of serfs and herdsmen underground. In Sang Sang's words, it was the wall of a well, but in fact, it was the wall of a prison. The herdsmen followed his finger and looked at the cliff, but they could not see the end. It was often surrounded by clouds and mist. They thought that this cliff was almost as high as the holy mountain. How could they climb up? For countless years, no one had ever climbed up this cliff. In the teachings of the monks, this idea gradually became an act of blasphemy to the Buddha. Who dared to try? The herdsmen looked at the cliff and suddenly came to their senses. They found that they really wanted to see what the ground above the cliff was. They could not help but feel guilty and kept kowtowing. Jun Mo looked at the herdsman and asked, "Don't you want to know what is above?" No one answered him. The old herdsman said piously, "Master, that place is the divine kingdom of Buddha. How can we sinful mortals go there?" Jun Mo ignored him and looked at the crowd, hoping to hear a different answer. However, after a long time, the lakeside was still quiet. He looked a little tired and a little disappointed. At this moment, the little girl who was holding Ning Kei's hand spoke. Maybe it was because Ning Kei's warm hands gave the little girl a lot of courage. She said softly in a clear voice, "I want to go up and have a look." Countless people looked at the little girl. Her mother even fainted. The little girl lowered her head, looking a little uneasy and scared. Ning Kei gently squeezed her hand and comforted her, "Don't be afraid." The little girl raised her head bravely. She pointed to somewhere in the middle of the cliff and said, "I not only want to go up, but I really went up. Although I didn't climb very high, I climbed there. From there, I can see further. I saw the lambs that ran to the Golden Lake. Then I found them. Then I saw a snow lotus on the cliff." The little girl said while looking at the crowd. The herdsmen by the lake looked up in shock. They followed the little girl's thin hand to look at the cliff and found that it was not high. They could really climb up. How could there be a snow lotus there? No matter how high the cliff is, as long as you dare to climb, you can climb to the top one day. But if you don't dare to climb, how can you see the snow lotus no matter how close it is? Jun Mo looked at the cliff and said calmly. Chapter 4, There's more today. I'll say it later because I'm hungry and haven't had dinner. Chapter 5 will be about 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.